Hey, well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to, I guess, it is week three now, 5:35. So I hope everyone is doing well in your week, even though it's very early on in the week. Your week is off to a good start. Tonight, our topic is fiscal federalism, and as you know, that's one of my favorite topics. But we have five articles that we are going to cover tonight on fiscal federalism, and according to my calendar, if it's correct. Those five articles, the first one, the George Brake article, is one that I will do. I don't think anyone signed up for that one, which is good because it's a very descriptive article and there's not a whole lot of analysis to it. So I'll start us off tonight with that article, just kind of give us a little insight into different types of grants and how they are structured and some of their advantages and disadvantages, just to kind of get us started tonight. Then we'll move to the Philip Moneypenny article, and that one I believe belongs to Jeremy. Then Entrepreneurial Cities, and that one is Heidi's. Why Categorical Grants belongs to Claudia. And then Financing Local Governments and Changing Time, the Bernori article belongs to Amanda. The 10th Commandments article we will move to next week, which will work fine because it's kind of the 10th Commandments is kind of it's a bridge between fiscal federalism and the more administrative aspects of federalism, kind of between grants and mandates. And so I think we move that to next week. So we'll have five articles tonight and then five articles for next week. Thank you for your discussion board posts. I think I am up to date with all those as of maybe about an hour and a half ago. So I do appreciate those posts. I think everyone's, again, doing a very good job on those. Your next discussion board post for next week then covers some of the material from our class session last week, and specifically the Camissa article about the public interest groups. And so for that discussion board post, what you'll be doing is you'll be selecting one public interest group to focus on. One of those we talked about last week, or another one we didn't talk about, that's fine as well. But those true public interest groups like National League of Cities or National Governors Association, National Conference of State Legislatures, those types of public interest groups, and talk a bit about what that public interest group is and how that public interest group has lobbied Congress and some of the hopefully successes that that public interest group has had in lobbying Congress. Because as we talked about last week, whenever a federalism question is considered to be political as opposed to constitutional, whenever those issues get pushed in the political world, that's where we have those public interest groups that have to get involved in order to try and get a redress of their grievances that will not be provided to them by the courts, since the courts determine it to not be a constitutional issue. So that's your next discussion board post that is coming up. Also, a reminder on these two article critiques that you will be doing. Just remember they need to be turned in before we discuss the article in class. So just keep that in mind. I know a few have trickled in so far. What usually happens in this class, and I understand it because everyone has very busy schedules and a lot of other things going on. Oftentimes they get backloaded to the end of the course, which is fine, but just do make sure that you adhere to that schedule of turning in the critique before we discuss the article in class. So yeah, the question is there a markdown if the article's turned in after the topic is covered? Yeah, there will be a late deduction for that because I really want to see you're thinking about the article before we've talked about the article in class. And so yeah, for full credit, make sure to get it turned in beforehand. So far, the few article critiques I've gotten up to this point have all been excellent, and so I've had no issues with any of them. People are using outside resources very well and some high quality outside resources. I've seen Publius used several times already, which is kind of, as I said, that top tier journal when you get into the field of federalism and intergovernmental relations. And so far, so good on those article critiques, but just, try and stay on top of them to make sure they don't kind of slip into and you kind of miss that due date. So, okay. Let's get into our topic for tonight. What I've done tonight is, so I don't have to slow things down and make people co-hosts, I've just enabled screen sharing for everyone. So whenever it comes your time to lead your discussion, you should then have the ability to share your screen and your slides if that's something that you want to do. I think just think by making it available at the beginning of class, it'll just speed things up a little bit for us. So if you are not leading a discussion tonight, don't put anything on the screen. That's just for people who are going to be leading their discussions tonight if they choose to use slides. But as we said last week, you don't have to use PowerPoint slides. I leave that choice completely up to you. So let me talk just for a few minutes about the break article and what the break article tells us about different types of grants. So our primary focus tonight with fiscal federalism will be about how the relationship between the different levels of government really ends up being dictated by money. The federal grants and aid to state governments, federal grants and aid to local governments, state grants and aid to local governments. That's usually the primary topic that we're going to look at tonight. So really to get us going, it's good to have a nice typology of what are the traditional types of grants and aid that we tend to use in our system of American intergovernmental relations. A lot of these grants you are already familiar with. Some of you may work with these grants on a daily basis, and so you know quite a bit about them. But we know that we have a spectrum of different types of grants, and that spectrum really runs from a lot of control for the grantor to the other end of the spectrum, which is a lot of flexibility and control for the recipient, for the grantee. So when we look at that spectrum, the type of grant that provides a lot of control for the grantor would be something like a categorical grant. So with these categorical grants, which some of you have worked with before, you understand that they are relatively specific grants and aid, and that federal money must be used for specific types of purposes. The federal money, once it's received by a state or a local government, will then trigger a lot of reporting and audit requirements. So you'll be held accountable for exactly how you are spending this money. The nice thing about a categorical grant from the grantor type of position is that it provides them a lot of control, and they can make sure that the money is being used in the way in which the federal government wants that money used. It will help to further the accomplishment of those national goals and objectives. For the recipient, obviously, you really give up some of that flexibility because you have to use the grant in the specific way in which you are required to use it. A lot of the special ed funding that we get in education, a lot of that money comes in kind of a categorical type of variety where we will have specific reporting requirements and we'll have a very narrow scope of activities that we can spend that grant money on. So that's at one end of the spectrum. Then at the other end of the spectrum will be unrestricted grants, things such as general revenue sharing. And I think we'd already mentioned when we talked about the development of federalism that during the Nixon administration, we had the use of this general revenue sharing, where the federal government would just turn over a percentage of revenue to state and local governments and basically allow them to use that money with very few, if any, strings attached. So it's just turning over a percentage of federal income tax revenue. That obviously is diametrically opposed to a very specific categorical grant. So it really does help foster the goals of new federalism, these things like decentralization, devolution, and deregulation. But I think we'd already mentioned the problem with general revenue sharing, the reason why we no longer see it used is because practically there is no revenue to share. And so if you have deficits year after year, federal government doesn't have the money to turn back over to state and local governments. And so in 1986, Reagan abolished general revenue sharing, not because he disagreed with it on philosophical grounds, but just he realized practically there was no revenue to share. So on one side, we have categorical grants. On the other side of the spectrum, we have unrestricted or nearly unrestricted grants, things such as general revenue sharing. Then in the middle, in this gray area in the middle, is where we then have another type of grant known as a block grant. And we've mentioned block grants before as well. A block grant is less restrictive than a categorical grant, but it does have more strings attached than general revenue sharing. In the block grant, we can spend the money kind of as we see fit, as long as we are spending it within the approved programmatic area. And so, one of the examples I used in the previous class was the example of welfare reform. So we replaced categorical grants with these block grants called temporary assistance and needy family grants. And those TANF grants could then be spent in a variety of different ways, as long as they were being spent to achieve the national objective of moving people from welfare into work, to move people into gainful employment. Block grants were something that a lot of state and local governments lobbied for very heavily throughout the 1980s. They got their wish in the Reagan administration as Reagan took 180 some categorical grant programs, combined them together, consolidated them together into 13 block grants. The nice thing is it provided flexibility for state and local governments. The bad thing was when he consolidated them into these 13 block grants, he then also took a lot of the funding away. So you got more flexibility, but you paid for it with less federal funding. So it's that bittersweet pill that state and local governments had to swallow. So that's kind of our typology of the primary types of grants that we see flowing out of the federal government. The federal government can give out these grants in a variety of different ways as well. One basis on which the federal government can award grants is through a formulaic process. And so the government will have a formula. They'll then take the characteristics of that potential recipient government, put those characteristics into the formula, and then determine who gets the money based upon how well they fare in that formula. Can also use that formulaic funding to determine how much money recipients will get. So a good example of formulaic funding is the foundational education funding that a lot of local school districts get from the state government. Most states use a foundation formula to determine how much state money each school district will get. So you take the characteristics of that school district and you then put those characteristics into the formula, and then you'll see what that base grant is that they get from the state. So whenever you put the characteristics in there, you'll put in characteristics such as their student population. So we'll look at the percentage of at-risk students that a district is servicing. And by at-risk students, we're talking about English learners. We're talking about students with disabilities. We're talking about students that in the past received what we're calling, free and reduced lunch programs here in California. School lunches are now free and available to everyone after COVID. But in the past, it was the students who received free and reduced lunch who qualified for that program. You would put that percentage of your at-risk population into the formula so that ostensibly districts that had a higher percentage of at-risk population students, they would then get a higher base grant from the state than more affluent districts. Now, here in California, if you have more than 55% of your students who are considered to be at-risk students, then you also qualify for what's called concentration funding. That concentration funding is then grant funding above and beyond your normal foundational basic state aid. And so if you have more than 55% of your students who fall into the at-risk category, then you get that additional funding from the state of California. So that's kind of a formulaic type of approach. And that's an approach to see how much money each local school district should get. Another alternative to the formulaic approach is the project-based approach. So sometimes we'll have project-based grants. In a project-based grant, governments will then compete for these grant monies. And so you put out a request for proposals. The local governments will then respond to that request for proposals, put together their proposal. Then the grantor, whether it be the federal or the state government, will then look at the quality of those proposals and will then decide which of those proposals to fund. So it's a competitive grant funding type of system. There are advantages and disadvantages to both formulaic as well as project-based distribution of grant money. One of the disadvantages to a formulaic approach is that sometimes the formulas are outdated. So every local school district in California has a designation in terms of what type of district it is. Is it an urban district? Is it a suburban district? Is this a rural district? And sometimes those designations have not been updated. And so the district I was on the board with, we were still considered to be a rural district, although the valley in which we exist is a valley that has it's a city that has a population of about 270,000 residents now. So we qualify as the third largest city in Los Angeles County. So it goes City of Los Angeles, City of Long Beach, and then Santa Clarita. But yet the district is still considered to be a rural district for that classification in foundation formula. And so sometimes if you don't update those formulas, if you don't engage in a process known as indexation, and indexation is where we go back and we change the amount of the increase each year for each one of those characteristics. If you don't go back and engage in indexation, then you're basically paying the same amount for each of those characteristics for each of those districts that you did perhaps in 1985. And so if you don't keep up with your formulas and you don't make these marginal incremental changes to your formulas, then they can become outdated and they don't really represent the true nature of the recipient government. So that's a problem sometimes with these formulas. Another problem is, just like anything we do with math and statistics, it's hard to boil everything down to numbers. And so you may have a district with all, or local government with all these different characteristics. Those characteristics may not represent accurately all of the challenges that that local government is facing. There could be unique idiosyncratic challenges that that government is facing that are not captured by that formula. So sometimes formulas are not quite as fair and equitable as we would hope that they would be. The advantage of a formula is that if the formula is kept up with, and we do our incremental revisions to the formula, then hopefully it will be a fair distribution of revenue, grant revenue to local governments. There are also advantages and disadvantages with a project basis for distributing funds. An advantage for the project basis is that governments, local governments, can apply for the grant programs that they are most interested in. So if a certain grant program will require them to do something that they are not interested in doing, then they will just refrain from applying for that grant program. And that's a decision they can make at that local level. The disadvantage is that sometimes it creates grantsmanship, where you have local governments that will hire professional grant writers who will then cast their net very broadly to try and apply to every grant that they can find to bring in as much money as they possibly can bring in. Because sometimes local governments will look at federal and state money as kind of being free money because it's not coming out of their locally sourced revenue. We know that there is no such thing as free money. We know this money does roll in, even if it's with a block grant, there are still going to be some limitations that are applied to that grant. We also know if we become too overly dependent upon other source grant money, so money that's not coming from our own tax base and non-tax base, then we kind of lose control over that funding. You don't know for sure that these federal grants are going to flow in year after year after year. You don't know that's going to happen. Here in California with education spending, we have a little bit more confidence because of Proposition 98 that requires that 40% of general fund revenue gets spent on K through 14 education. But there are still some instances where that's not necessarily the case. In our post-COVID kind of doldrums that we're having in terms of generating revenue, we know what that caused in terms of the May revise this past May and how all the revisions that had to be made to this proposed state budget. One of those revisions was that the governor's office was going to reduce K through 14 state spending. Well, once they were threatened by the California Teacher Association with a whole PR campaign, they kind of backed off on that. But there is a possibility that in times of fiscal emergency, even that 40% guarantee may not be an ironclad guarantee, even at the state level. So we know we do have a problem when we get too reliant upon grants. And if a government spends all its time going out there and chasing after grants, there are opportunity costs associated with that, which means that's less time they can spend doing the types of service delivery that they need to do on a daily basis to satisfy the wants, needs, and desires of their citizens. Then with these grants, regardless of which type of grant we are using and regardless of how that money is being distributed, then the other complicating factor with intergovernmental grants is this matching feature. And we know that the federal government, if it has a vested interest in the accomplishment of the goals associated with a grant, they may incorporate a matching feature with the grant, where they will tell a local government or a state government, we will match the amount of revenue that you raise for this expenditure dollar for dollar, up to a certain amount. That would be what's considered to be a closed-end matching grant. So we'll say, we will match dollar for dollar up to $500,000 that you raise. We will then give you $500,000 in federal revenue to match the amount of revenue that you raise. An open-ended matching grant is where the federal government would say, we are going to match you dollar for dollar, irrespective of how much money you raise. So if you raise $1 million, we'll match it up to $1 million. Now, we don't see a whole lot of those open-ended matching grants unless it's something that is really a national objective, something that the national government is very, very interested with trying to achieve. We would normally think that matching grants, having these matching components, that's a great thing for grant recipients. The problem is sometimes it will distort state and local preferences. So, think about a situation where a local government is deciding between funding a recreation center and a senior citizen center. So when you're choosing between those two capital projects, you're going to go out there and do your benefit cost analysis. So you'll monetize the benefits that will accrue from the recreation center, monetize the benefits that will accrue from the senior center, monetize the costs associated with both of those projects, and then you'll calculate your benefit cost ratio. The project that comes out with the more favorable benefit cost ratio is the one that probably is going to be funded. Then along comes the federal government. So let's say that the recreation center created a benefit cost ratio of 1.5. The senior center had a benefit cost ratio of 1.2. So normally your preference would be for the recreation center. Then along comes the federal government and says, we have a vested interest in seeing you construct more senior centers. So we're going to give you this matching grant. That matching grant will then lower the cost of that senior center significantly. And as your denominator gets smaller, then your resulting statistic, your resulting benefit cost ratio will become larger. So by reducing the cost of that senior center, then that benefit cost ratio may shoot up from a 1.2 to a 1.8. But once it gets up to a 1.8, it now exceeds the 1.5 benefit cost ratio of the recreation center. And so now we're going to fund the senior center. Even though local preference was initially for the recreation center, this matching grant has now distorted that local preference. So that's one of the concerns that we have with matching grants. A more practical concern that we have with matching components is the faith that we have in the federal government that they will actually make good on their promises of matching the money that's being raised at the state or the local level. So that's what BREAK does for us. It just kind of gives us this typology of different types of grants, unrestricted, like general revenue sharing versus block grants versus categorical grants, different ways of funding these grants on a formulaic basis or on a project basis, and then a matching or a non-matching component, depending upon how concerned the national government is at truly achieving whatever objective is aligned with and associated with this grant. So just providing that as kind of a basic overview, it gives us the basis, the foundation that we need in order to go ahead and understand the articles that we have assigned for tonight in our discussion of fiscal federalism. So with that as our background, let's get into our first discussion of the night. And that one is the Philip Moneypenny article, Federal Grants and Aid in State Government, a Political Analysis. I love this article, not just because it's a great article, but I also love it because Philip Moneypenny. You can't get better than that with a budgeting name. But this one belongs to Jeremy. And so, Jeremy, I'll go ahead and hand it off to you.
Right. Well, I hope I do it justice because it took a couple rereadings this whole week because it's a lot to take in. But yeah, let me get started. Hope everyone's doing well. All right. Are y'all viewing the presenter view as well?
Yeah, we're seeing we see the current slide 1 of 6, and next slide. Okay, there we go. Yeah, now we're seeing
There we
one
go.
slide at a time.
Cool. Where's my mouse? There we are. Cool. So as the professor mentioned, thank you, Dr. Powell, we'll be doing federal grants and aid to states, a political analysis by Philip Moneypenny, who this article is quite admittedly very short, extremely dense. I even looked up Philip Moneypenny after just because I'm like, what else has he commented on? And I just wanted to see he is very I mean, I'll get into it. It's a really interesting analysis, I would say. So he begins this article by talking about the current federal aid system, essentially introducing what it is, which I'm not going to go over because at this point we've all have a pretty decent understanding of what federal grants look like, and I mean we've talked about it for a couple of weeks, and I don't want to make you go through that again. But he kind of dumbs it down to the fact that a federal grant is money to states to help them do an essential activity at a minimum level. So he introduces it at that kind of base level and instantly starts critiquing the fact that the minimum is not the same for every state, that every state requires different levels of help to meet a certain minimum. For example, if you're trying to compare curriculums from Idaho to Florida, one state might require more funding than it would the other just to get it to the basic level that the federal government has considered a minimum. So he starts off the bat just kind of saying you can't say it's the same for all states when it really truly isn't and can never be that way. Um, that example that I gave is pretty simple, but he goes into a couple other different ones. He also goes on to explain that federal grants are supposed to be around issues of national interest. That's what he calls them. So, for example, roads, obviously highways that connect all the states are a national interest. But again, this is the federal government funding. I think he mentioned 90% of all the roads in the country, and these are by lawmakers and they create the plans for them. And these are lawmakers from different states essentially deciding which way the freeway is going to go with little to no knowledge of like what's happening in that state. So that's another issue that he found is the fact that states are more than willing to accept it and just kind of take the repercussions of what the aid is, regardless of what it does to their state, for the free funds, essentially. And there was this interesting quote that he put. Sorry, nope, I can't move. There it is. I can't move the Zoom pictures and it's covering. Well, I'll deal with it. So no major federal grant is based primarily on the equalization factor, and which includes such a factor did not begin to produce a uniform level of standardization. Essentially just kind of wrapping up what we spoke about in the sense that as much as it wants to bring everybody to the same level will not help everybody or will impact everyone the same way. And kind of wanted to open up this question to the group of what grants, obviously grants can be as hyper specific to groups or to interest groups or to states or to communities. So like what grants would you request from your local leaders if you had the ability to ask for one? I know we spoke about this briefly in other discussions, and I know a large one that came up was like uh, folks who are struggling from homelessness and who don't have houses. And I see a hand, Amanda. If you want to go ahead and take yourself off mute.
Yeah, and I think I kind of said this in a previous discussion that was kind of talking about similar issues, but like I think infrastructure projects are a big one just because those can be so costly. And I have a feeling that, obviously cities try to plan for things like that because they're inevitable, but I think with especially inflation these days, like it's just so expensive to do the same project as it was, 10 years ago. So that's where like grants can come in to help get those things done without completely decimating a city budget.
Yeah, definitely, especially just with the kind of like the way you have to appropriate those funds specifically can get a little difficult, especially for something like infrastructure, but it's 1,000% necessary at this point. I mean, we've seen bridges crumble in the past year just because of the lack of care of infrastructure. And so it definitely is an issue that we'll probably be seeing more if it's not addressed, in my opinion. Maria, I think I saw your hand after. Thank you, Amanda.
Yeah, I was gonna say, there's also like something I would request would be like funding for mental health services, such as like for substance abuse prevention or health outreach programs in underserved like communities. Because I feel like we're seeing a lot of that, especially with like the unhoused individuals. Like it's just creating um more aid that needs to be provided. And
Yeah, no, I agree. I think I don't know if the city of Los Angeles did it well, but they definitely try to appropriate funds for that. Um, I mean, we're seeing the outroll of it, so it's hard to say what the effect of that has been. But yeah, no, definitely would help from some federal grants as well. Esmeralda, did you want to go next as well?
Yes, I was about to also mention more resources for mental health and also educating parents because it's hard to have those conversations, especially if they're coming from certain type of culture where it's looked down upon, just so they understand the different resources. And if it would even be possible, like making Wi-Fi available to low income families. I know there have been programs, but they seem to come and go, and it's really difficult if they don't have access to the internet and the computer for them to do homework, research, or whatever it may be.
Thank you. And you actually bring up a good point that yeah, sometimes grants are available for X amount of years, and then obviously the funding runs out, or it's not what it used to be. So what that minimum was at a certain time is no longer the minimum for the same place for the same group of people in the next 2 to 3 years, just because of inflation and other reasons as well. But thank you to both of you. Thank you, Esmeralda and Maria. Oh, Heidi, anything else? Oh,
Sorry.
accidentally.
Oh, sorry, I couldn't find
Oh,
my mute button. I would add, and it's on top of the like additional housing support or funding, but specifically to the disabled population because they have very unique needs. They don't have as many options to kind of find ways to meet those needs. They're very quite limited and they have to compete with others, not necessarily who are undeserving, but that may have options that are not at their reach. So I was thinking about that as well.
yeah, thank you, Heidi. And I think you bring up a good point in the sense that federal grants can sometimes just be blankets, and it's kind of supposed to be a one kind of thing fit all, and that's kind of an issue that Moneypenny agrees with in the sense that it's hard to make it as specific as it needs to be for some of those cases that they would just appropriate one set of levels and it doesn't fit or doesn't work for everyone essentially. But yeah, thank you. He goes on to continue to critique the federal aid system as it is, and I found this quote, which let me move this box at least to try to read it better. So he had a lot of really good quotes. They're long, but they added a lot. Work with me. There we go. Perfect. All right, let me begin. So it is true that federal aid may have been a factor in persuading the less-ready states to undertake what has already been undertaken elsewhere. It is hard to make a case for federal aid as a pioneering measure. So he went on to critique the fact that federal grants make states less willing to like help themselves essentially. Like they will kind of wait out for a federal grant to come along for an issue that they're fully aware of and they're fully probably can change themselves within the state without the help of the federal government, but they just have been accustomed to receiving a grant for that and they just kind of rely on that and they will wait around for the government to come around. He also goes on to say that grant dependency has become a big issue, that the states are no longer finding ways to raise funds themselves, or they have the ability to, they just choose not to. And the federal grants definitely come in aid of that. And it just kind of becomes they have to wait around for a grant to come around for something that they to make a difference in their own states, essentially. He gives an example of, like, as I mentioned, the raising funds that states can raise their own funds, which would be property taxes. They can, but they don't. They choose not to. And so they'll, like, for infrastructure, for example, when they need to, they will raise the funds for on property taxes to help infrastructure. And when they haven't wanted to, they just won't. And they'll just wait around for something to come around. And I think a good example that I found was from my work that we recently have gotten to awarded a lot of federal grants for to do work on tribal lands. I think I mentioned it in other classes, but I work in a nonprofit that installs solar on homes, and I'm part of the human resources team, so I'm not the one doing the work out there, but we have to find these people on who are from tribal lands, like recognized tribal lands, and the states don't want to do it. The states, I mean, obviously the lands are on state grounds, but the states don't want to touch them, so it relies on federal grants to come in to do some work that honestly is just to give them electricity, just because the grid out there is so unreliable that somebody has to step in. So we'll get into kind of his back and forth in the sense that it doesn't, what does he say? It doesn't pioneer much innovation, but I mean, you can see it both ways. He kind of is kind of critiquing the system overall, but that is a sense of the states didn't want to do it. The states know it's an issue, but they won't. So the federal government has to go in and grant federal grants to get them to do work needed within their own system, within their own states. So he kind of continues on with more issues with the grants overall, like the way that the grants are given and the way that the funds are and the way that the programs work. And he kind of lays out this level of issues when you work with federal grants. So he thinks that the fact that a lot of the people within the states that are given federal grants are kind of able to be more risky with the money because what like it's not our money, so let's just spend it on what we think we need. It's not necessarily taken as well care of as it would state funds. He believes that it adds an extra legislative layer, which I don't know if anybody else has. Actually, let me start with that. Has anybody worked with a federal grant before, or administrating it, or just kind of overall any work with the federal grant? I know from my work that they're very taxing. Oh, Chris, did you want to go ahead?
Yeah, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay. So I kind of want to I'm currently working with a federal grant, and I do feel like kind of what to your point a little bit earlier in that we, at least for my line of work, we kind of have like this program that we waited until the grant funding is there for us to administer. Like we don't really budget within our own fiscal year budget to do some type of initiative like that. Like we're always kind of dependent on these grants. But from my experience, when I actually have been able to work with the federal level grant, it's been a lot more cumbersome than the state grant funding. It's almost like I don't know, like almost like once you remove, it's like federal grants are so high up there, it's kind of removed from the actual work that us administering the grant are doing, that it leaves like a big gap of misunderstanding from like their expectations to what can actually be done. But that's just been my experience with it. Whereas compared with state grants, they're kind of in tune with more with kind of how local agencies run. Therefore, the state grants seem like they have more realistic targets and goals associated with them.
Thanks, Chris. No, that's a perfect summary of what my experience working with the federal grant is. It's a lot more cumbersome. It's a lot more paperwork. It's a lot of tracking. Like, for example, just this past week, I had to go through like 3 different emails just to look for documentation of like that we received a very specific check. So even just kind of keeping track of that stuff and making sure that you're properly documenting every single little thing that happens, um, it's a lot. It's a lot to do. And yeah, as Chris mentioned, you don't really start working on it until you have the funds to do it. So it's not something states are more than willing to spend their money on. They will wait around until that penny lands to move any to just start moving on that whatever that initiative would be. Esmeralda, do you want to go ahead and take yourself off mute?
Yes, I was just gonna make a comment that I do agree with the author. I do feel that federal grants, they make the states dependent on them, and maybe that is like the purpose behind it. So there can be some sense of federalism, the relationship between the different types of government, but in this type of on this topic, the federal government has more power, and it could be dangerous because my example is like the states are becoming dependent. Um so they're waiting for money to come in when they can actually try to attempt to solve some of the problems, but they're choosing not to because they're waiting for federal grants. And that's very dangerous because I see it in students. I know it's very different. Some are very dependent learners. Um, and it's like to the point where it's like if their computer is not charged, 1/10 grader will not go get a charger. They just stare at the computer and they say the computer is dead. So in my head, I'm making the connections. I'm like, well, if some states there's a lot of smart, capable people, instead of, suggesting why don't we do this or, you know, put it in our budget, they're so dependent on the federal grants that I feel that that's why there's a lot of unsolved problems because they're just so dependent. And I don't know, I'm just going on a rant, but I'm seeing it from both sides and I'm like, this is very dangerous in my opinion. I just feel like so much could be done, but to some extent, yes, money is everything, especially to manage a whole state. But I think there is wiggle room, but sometimes that's not the way things are. And it does probably have to do with the way that, questions are asked politically and all that stuff.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, Money Penny, thanks, Esmeralda, agrees with that in the sense that he teeters a lot back and forth. Like he understands why it is like their purpose, but then to that exactly that the states will accept the money to begin a project, but once the money runs out, they won't continue the project themselves. They'll just either let it die out or carry it out at a lesser level. So does that create more issues, or did that create issues that weren't there before? That's kind of his argument of it as well. So thank you. He also goes on to explain that grants have become a big part, do exist in part because of our current political system. Um, a lot of politicians will use grants that they'll promise grant funding for if you vote for me, I'll ensure that this happens when I reach the office that I want to reach. And it kind of creates that. I mean, it's a way to sway voters, right? It's a way to divide people more, and it just becomes how does that problem affect me rather than affect the group overall? Like, why does that funding need to go to that group when that's not me? So they become divisive. It's helpful when you're a politician and you need a lot of votes and you need to garner a lot of attention and a lot of support. But in that end, it's just it becomes another tool that becomes murky, and it just kind of becomes promises that people are expecting, because when it just creates a dependency of when we need something to be fixed, we look at the federal government as opposed to our local leaders, or we just don't know who to expect help from. So it just kind of creates that vagueness with it all, and it just doesn't really, I mean, it doesn't make sense to the normal day person as you'd imagine. So I wanted to ask the group, does anybody have an example of a federal grant that they themselves like were opposed to or have strong feelings for? Like my work is primarily it's renewable energy, so I obviously have to be very for grants for renewable energy just because that's what keeps my lights on, ironically. But also it's just it's done with the intention of a cleaner world, not just for me, but for everyone. And it's supposed to help us all overall. And that some states are more willing to do that. I mean, we want to say majority of us live in California, so we have that advantage that those kinds of funds and those kinds of groups are out there, but it's not necessarily, I wouldn't say it's in the entire country, right? So those kinds of federal grants would be more appreciated within our state. And I think Esmeralda kind of touched on this earlier, where he believes that grants are kind of a refinement, or what he calls a refinement of federalism, that it kind of creates that dependency on each other, where grants are given to states, which then states can kind of grant themselves, or vice versa, where it's just federal grants given to specific groups within states. That it kind of is that continuation of federalism of like that interdependency of the large federal government and state governments, which is essentially what the Federalists wanted to do. And this is just another kind of system that only operates well in a system like ours that requires both to be involved and to both to have a say and to both, I mean, give it a place to continue to live, essentially. And that's what he believes federal grants do exist. And he does come around at the end to just kind of explain that it's just part of our system in the United States and very unique to the way that we do things because of federalism. So I just kind of wanted to end with its overall. I mean, Esmeralda, like that was great. You kind of beat me to the punch of, do you agree with Moneypenny's critique? Because I mean, when we think of federal grants, it's kind of something you always don't question and just kind of take if you're able to apply for them, right? But I guess they do deserve some form of critique in the sense that they are confusing. They do require more work. They are not state specific in the sense that now we have a freeway that cuts through this town and divides like Los Angeles alone. You can tell those freeways were made by people that could care less and obviously were put there intentionally to split cities up, and now we're all just kind of suffering it for the past decades of just the way that the cities are and the way things are laid out by people who work in the federal government who don't live in California per se. But yeah, anybody want to share their thoughts on it or on federal grants in the system? If not, I can end it there. Thanks, everyone.
Okay, thank you very much, Jeremy. Very well done. You hit all the major points of the article and the conclusion that's the most important aspect of the article, that federalism is a refinement. Grants are a refinement of our system of federalism. I think the passage he has is on page so 185 there at the bottom. The grant and aid system is by no means an undermining of federalism, but rather a refinement of it. And he comes to that conclusion, as Jeremy led us through very skillfully, by using what we usually call in the argumentative speak a straw man argument. So a straw man argument, you set up all these different arguments that you know are not going to be valid, but you set them up just for the purpose of knocking them down. And then that will then provide you with the support that you need for your final conclusion. His final conclusion that grants are a refinement of federalism, they're not an undermining of federalism. And so some of those straw man approaches he uses, as Jeremy told us, things like, well, we have these federal grants because of equalization, because we want to equalize across different states, and different states have different capabilities. And so we want to use it for equalization. And he knocks that down and he says, well, most of these grant programs don't have equalization formulas in them to begin with. So obviously that's not their primary purpose. So another straw man is that everyone says that, well, it's to try and further a national objective. And he says, well, what is a national objective? Do we have agreement on what a national objective is? And his basic argument is, we really don't have a general agreement over what's considered to be a national objective. It's difficult for us to parcel out a national objective from a state or local objective. Personally, I think that's one of his weaker arguments because I do think that there are some national objectives. I do think we see that in a lot of these grant programs. I mean, and oftentimes these federal grant programs are relatively specific about what the objective is, and it oftentimes is a national objective, sometimes over the objections of state and local governments. He says, well, sometimes these grants are used then to probably stimulate state and local government activity. And Jeremy took us through that one as well. We know that a lot of the programs that are implemented at the national level come from the state level. That states are these laboratories of democracy, and they kind of try out these programs, and the programs that are effective for these states are then adopted at the national level. So it's not really stimulating thought or stimulating spending at state and local level of government. So that doesn't really hold water either. Says, well, maybe there's greater administrative competence by having it done at the federal level as opposed to the state or local level. And he kind of laughs at that. And he thinks that's kind of funny that the national government would have more administrative competence than the state or local government. So knocks that straw man down as well. He says, well, maybe it's another possible explanation is that states don't have the capability to raise the revenue and raise the money that they need in order to carry out these programs, and so they have to rely upon the federal government. Well, as we see in a lot of the other articles in the O'Toole textbook, a lot of authors will make the argument that actually when you compare states to other provincial and other subnational governments and other federalism systems, states in America oftentimes have more capacity to raise revenue and have more wealth than a lot of provincial governments that you would see in other federalist systems. So that one gets knocked down. So he goes through, I won't go through them all, but he goes through and knocks down each of these one by one to then get him to this final conclusion, as Jeremy told us, that grants and aid are really a refinement and not a perversion of our system of federalism. I'll leave out some of the other things that he talks about because I don't want to tread too much on the why categorical grants article that's coming up in a couple of discussions, because there's a lot of overlap between Moneypenny's article, his arguments, and what we're going to see in that why categorical grants article. But just very quickly, it fits our system of federalism very well because of, number one, our system of Congress. And that you don't have a lot of agreement in Congress. There's not a lot of specificity of aim with legislation that's introduced into Congress. And so it just kind of makes sense that you would, instead of doing it through rules and legislation, you would then accomplish your goals through grants, and especially grants such as categorical grants. And he says also another reason that we oftentimes see these grants being used is because of it allows Congress to use its fiscal power as opposed to its policy power. And it's easier to issue a grant than it is to issue a mandate. And so because of that ease of issuing grants, that's another reason why politically we see grants used a lot in our system of federalism. And I'm not going to get into much more of that because, again, I don't want to step too much on the article that's coming up. But he is a very big believer that basically categorical grants are here because of our political system. And our political system explains a lot of the reason why we have these federal grants in aid. And that's kind of the theme that runs through a lot of the articles that we are going to cover tonight. So thank you very much, Jeremy. Very well done. I appreciate that. Great discussion. And we will now move to our next article, which I believe is the Entrepreneurial Cities article, the Spraja article. And I think that one belongs to Heidi. So I will turn it over to you, Heidi.
Okay, give me 1 second. I'm trying to. Let's see. Can you all see my presentation?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, perfect. Good evening, everybody. So today I have the opportunity of presenting the article by Alberta Spragiat, Entrepreneurial Cities, Federalism, and Economic Development. Let me put this to work. Give me 1 second. Okay, here we go. I thought it would be helpful, and I know that I think most people know what entrepreneurship is, but to be honest with you, reading the definition kind of helped me to understand this article a little bit more, and specifically the parts where of the definition that helped me to understand was that entities or persons who organize, manages, and assumes the risk of a business with the goal of generating economic value. So Spragia specifically talks about this in the article, and she relates it to how governments are act within our federalist system. He highlights the fact that local governments are like entrepreneurs, since one of their important functions involves pursuing their special interest. This article highlights how local governments do so through strategies of circumvention. Local governments, as we know, have finite resources to meet organizational needs, and they have become creative in their approaches in order to address their constraints that they're experiencing. And so this brings me to my first question, which is to everybody, what sort of constraints do local governments contend with that perhaps we've already talked about or something that you want to bring up? And I think this will aid in the discussion. And just so you know, I don't have the ability to see the screen. So if you just want to pop in, that would be very helpful.
Hi, Heidi. I would probably just say funding. I think that the funding levels are always a constant struggle for local governments.
For sure. Funding is a constant struggle. Because of this, a lot of the cities have to be quite creative in how they solve this problem. So that's definitely one big struggle that cities have. You're absolutely right. Anything else that anyone else can think of? So if no one else has other thoughts, what I was thinking of as well is, for example, not only like financial constraints, but also in the manpower and who is making decision, who organizes. All of this requires money. So this is another barrier sometimes that cities have. Kind of to move on, there are all significant, so public officials must find ways to circumvent them. In the scope of this discussion, Spragia comments that these approaches have downfalls that creates future limitations. We'll discuss this a little bit further down the line, but I just wanted to mention this because he makes a big point about this later. These approaches historically lead to repetitive patterns where innovation of approach may lead to more restrictions by state and federal governments, with state courts needing to mediate these issues. So what he's talking about here is essentially that when these institutions or these governments find creative ways to get around some of these barriers, they use specific techniques, they use specific strategies. We'll talk about, municipal bonds, public authorities, those sort of things. And sometimes those might kind of, they will, sorry, lost my train of thought, but basically those might not be in line with federal requirements. And so that will lead sometimes to more restrictions or the federal government exerting their power. And so when that happens, sometimes the courts need to step in and make judgment calls on some of these strategies. And then cities will find new ways to get around them. Courts sometimes have to intervene, like I said, and then it just becomes kind of like this constant cycle. And this has a significant impact in the dynamic of this type of situation. Most of the time, cities will opt to fight these laws and restrictions because it is easier to do so. So when we consider, for example, the key players in this dynamic, we consider the role of Congress. So Congress is the entity or the level of government that permits grant tax exemptions and directs it. So some of these creative ways that cities find are actually permitted through Congress. The Supreme Court eventually allowed the use of municipal bond markets. At the state level, obviously, we have the judicial courts that interpret or mediate any conflicts between local governments when they're being accused of not following federal order. And then, of course, other key players in this dynamic are the private sector. So investors that may invest in municipal bonds, including banks, mutual funds, etc. So I think I already answered this question, but perhaps not. But why might you all think, or do you have an idea of why cities might opt to avoid or find creative ways to get around these laws instead of fighting the laws? So I think one of the things to consider is the fact that which option might be easier for the cities? Would it be easy to fight the law, or would it easier to find creative ways to get around it? And why would that be?
I can chime
Uh,
in.
Oh, thank you, Esmeralda.
Um, I would say sometimes it's kind of easier to just find a creative way around it because you don't want to shut people out or close doors. I'm just going back based on like funding. It's just easier to find creative ways.
Mhm.
It's better to ask for forgiveness than
Very
uh
true.
in my experience, it just works out better instead of just closing doors and um in case that you do want to go the federal route, that's still an option.
Very much so. And then aside from that, I think you bring up a good point, but I also was thinking to myself as you were sharing that the federal government for me seems almost like a beast, right? Like this untouchable, supreme level of government. And then to fight it, you have to go to the level of Supreme Court, higher courts, and that seems more daunting than finding creative ways within your environment, especially when there are options. So I think that's also quite important. I wasn't sure if somebody else was also chiming in.
Hey Heidi, yeah, I also wanted
Oh.
to add that exactly that the federal government, I mean, it would be you against their long list of lawyers as well as their deeper pockets, I would imagine. Have the money to continue a battle than you would be able to, and it's easier to think of a different alternative than to take it on like straight head on.
Most definitely, and it's our human nature, right, to pick the path of least resistance. And so I think that's very much in our human nature, and governments, local governments follow this as well. So thank you both for your feedback.
And then Heidi, I also had a contribution to that too.
Oh yeah, Chris,
Yeah,
thank you.
yeah, absolutely. So I do feel like the beauty in it is that the law a lot of times is open to interpretation. And I think, at least for the work I do, whenever there's a law that particular pertains to like the water industry or like reducing water, whatever it may be, um, I th I find a lot of times we don't fight the law, or if we do, it's a big coalition that happens to that. But a lot of times it's like open to our interpretation, and sometimes it's better and easier for us to just kind of like because a lot of times the federal government doesn't like strike down on local municipalities, at least from my experience. So it's like you can kind of like what Esmeralda says, like take the approach where you ask for forgiveness if needed, but you
That's
definitely
true.
don't try to fight them because, like Jeremy says, and well, like everyone's saying, it's like a beast in itself. So I don't think anyone wants to take time out of their busy work schedule to to really allocate time towards doing something like that. So I think just dancing around it is a lot easier than taking it face on.
For sure, definitely finding ways to avoid them is far less work, requires far less resources, right? Than to approach or try to fight the federal government. And you know, sometimes it like you said, if we consider the federal government and all of the smaller subnational governments that exist throughout the United States, there's, you know, hundreds and thousands, I would imagine. And so how the government keeps tracks of all this, I'm not sure, but I'm sure that at some point the government may pick an entity to set an example, to establish precedent. So that also has some bearing to it. So thank you all for sharing that. Unless there's anybody else, I'll move on.
Hi,
So
hi, Heidi.
hi.
I was also gonna piggyback on what everyone's saying, but just I think cities avoid fighting just to save time and money
Mhm.
because they're trying to meet resident needs directly.
Mhm.
So that's what I would think of.
That's very much true. I think that each city has their objectives. You know, their constituents have elected officials based on certain issues. And I also think that the objective of cities is to have as much funding as possible, right? And so this leads me to this next part of the presentation when we talk about municipal bond market and private money. So one way that the city government circumvented this issue was to access the municipal bond market. So this municipal bond market essentially allows governments to be able to fund for, you know, capital infrastructure, things, objectives within their city government by borrowing money, right? And this involves private investors, like I said, it involves banks, mutual funds, etc. Oh, and so historically, governments have cycles between entrepreneurship, restriction, and circumvention. This is something that is going to be a constant theme throughout this presentation because Spragia talks a lot about it. And he talks about this dynamic because later on we'll understand a little bit more how this shapes the market, how it shapes this intergovernmental issue that we're talking about. So within the system, obviously it has, right, a government side, but it also has the private side, like like private economy side, where, you know, a lot of these cities have to make judgment calls about borrowing, and they have to kind of present themselves in a favorable manner, have a history of good decision making, like many of us individuals who consider our credit score. I always remember our discussions when we had finance, that cities actually have a type of credit rating. And this is especially important because in the federal, there's no federal guarantees. So whenever an investor is, you know, giving these monies, there's no federal guarantee. So a lot of these cities have to prove themselves. But within this dynamic or this option that cities have, there's also constraints. So the Congress has the power, has allowed for the municipal bond market to exist or to be accessible to cities, but at the same time with constraints. They establish the parameters about how they can use them. And sometimes when they're outside of what the federal government thinks, they might come down on cities and expect them to correct that issue. So I think that one other thing I wanted to mention about this is similar to what other people had mentioned. A lot of the times, cities will push the limits in order to maybe if there's a gray area where they think that the federal government might oppose, they might just give it a try and ask for forgiveness later. So that's one of the things that is also mentioned within the article. The private sector has a way to facilitate political strategies by the local governments when because they're benefiting from it. So options and opportunities for the city are a byproduct of government, courts, and the capital markets. So public authorities is another strategic option that governments establish. These are what we consider quasi-governments. And they are created as another strategy to maneuver or to get around some of the restrictions that the federal government might establish. And it was established during a time when the market the municipal bond market, I'm sorry, was common throughout cities, municipalities, and it was quite the norm. But eventually, like with any type of approach, maybe there's saturation within the market. And so there started to be restrictions, for example, debt limits. And then a lot of the times they required electoral approval, and sometimes governments were trying to avoid these restrictions. And so that's how public authorities came into were created, right? And some of the characteristics about these that allows them to get around some of the restrictions is that they're independent of the city. So they don't necessarily have to follow the same rules, and they often operate in specialized areas. So, and I know many of us work for public authorities and can give some examples. They can issue bonds, so they're organizations that have similar abilities in that they can to the government or local governments, and they can issue bonds, they could collect fees, and they're somewhat autonomous. But with this creation of this type of option or strategies, there's also some negative aspects. Because they're independent of the city, it reduces the power or influence and decision-making power of officials. So they're delegating this authority to specialized private managed groups. And so they are not able to directly influence the decisions or the management that these organizations have. They may also prioritize efficiency and technical expertise versus accountability. So maybe they'll cut corners, or, a lot of us are bound by our ethical code of public administrators, and not that they are not subject to ethical standards, but obviously as independent organizations, it's quite different. So with this, I have a question. What public authorities are you aware of, or are you affiliated or work for? What advantages do you see, and potentially what disadvantages?
Yeah, Heidi, I work for a public housing authority, and so the one thing that I would say is, my housing authority is overseen by a board, but the board are appointed by the mayor. So I don't know that in my case that it really reduces the power of local officials, because she has the ability to remove and instate like people who are more to her liking. And we recently lost our CEO, and there was some controversy about that because many people believe it has to do with his relationship with the mayor. And so I think that public officials still have a significant amount of influence over some public authorities, even when it appears that they don't.
Right. I think you bring up a good point because they're not completely independent. They're still subject to the scrutiny of boards. I know in my particular organization, we're a nonprofit, but we do have a board that oversees operations, helps to establish policies, and they make sure constituents are happy. I think that part of the disconnect may be in the day-to-day management, right? Decisions about how to organize internally, how to set up systems, those sort of things. But I see your point, how there is influence, but there's also like a division as well, right? So thank you for your feedback. Anybody else? So those were really good points. Thank you, Daniel. So part of the article also talks about the entrepreneurship of local governments in two phases. So between the 1970s and the 1980s, capital investments were prominent. These investments were only instruments allowed within the parameters of the law. Again, courts were critical of these. What followed was competition to attract industries that promote economic development for financial gain within cities. And so in the mid 80s, restrictions made borrowing expensive, leading to more innovation. Politicians positioned themselves to influence federal and economic system and ways to manipulate it. What resulted was quite complex. So it's this intertwined dynamic, one influencing the other. Cities are now more like interest groups, public authorities left to choose from a portfolio of policy choices based on the past with great variability. So if you think about what options are in our suburban areas versus rural areas would be different, or what options we have here or in Texas are likely very different depending on the region. And so there is a multitude of options, but those options are also dependent on the area or where the particular government or institution is. And obviously, with these choices, our public authorities were then created by officials with drawbacks as discussed. Officials still need to address constituent needs while maneuvering the legal constraints. Often, this leads to coalitions and rewards to friends. So a lot of the times, these creative ways lead to individuals, setting up agreements between one another to kind of help to push their agendas. This is how the market is essentially shaped, like the relationship between all of those levels, not just structurally, but also the influence that they have on each other. It creates a public and private relationship that is symbiotic and interdependent to circumvent all of these different restrictions. So at the end of the day, what I'm trying to say is that public authorities kind of added and made it even more complicated. So with that, I have another question. What industries do your respective cities are trying to attract? So, and the reason why I say this is because with the answer may come, why is it? Obviously, the majority of the time it's for economic gain, but there might be other reasons depending on the issue or the industry.
Hey Heidi, this is Emily. I live in Long Beach, and Long Beach is a pretty significant aerospace hub. And I think that's for kind of a variety of reasons. There's a pretty big, long history of aviation in Long Beach. It's also its location. how close it is to Cal State Long Beach as well. I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I know there are a significant number of engineering students that kind of filter through the different aerospace companies located right by the Long Beach airport. So it's big on the talent pool and the location, also close to the different military bases, like the one in Seal Beach, for example. So, and I think it tends to be potentially a pretty lucrative industry, and has the potential to grow. So obviously financially it's going to be a reason for pursuing that. And just also, I think, contributing just to the advancements in technology also. So those are some potential reasons why it might attract people from that industry.
Most definitely. And one of the things that, oddly enough, one of my friends at some point was or worked for the Department of Economic Development. I'm pretty sure that's not exactly what they're called, but for the city of Long Beach. And this was a long time ago before I started this program. And I remember one of our conversations, she was kind of talking about what you're saying, that their intent was to attract individuals to come to their city in order to make it a more interesting, or to appeal to the majority of the population. But also they considered how sometimes work-related projects required for engineers or people in the industry, in the technological industry, to travel to their area, because obviously they want to mix work with pleasure, right? They want to go to a place where maybe they work during the day, but it's also an attractive area to spend their money. And so dually they are taking advantage of this, not just attracting people to visit, but also for them to go out into the community and spend, which is, I think, the ultimate goal of a lot of cities. So thank you for your feedback. Anybody else?
Yeah, I can add to this one too, Heidi. For our region, we have the Ontario Airport situated with us, and they're kind of like our big, like they're very important for sure. At least a lot of importance is put onto them by the city of Ontario and also by my agency. And like specifically, one example I can give is like for one of my programs I'm running, I'm supposed to replace turf at the Ontario Airport, or at least hire a contractor to do that. And I just know that like we have set rules for our program, but when it comes to Ontario Airport, we'll like literally change the rules for anything just to make sure that they are happy. So I totally get that. There's like certain constituents that can make that put importance on that like some agencies will put a preference sometimes. Just wanted to share that.
Yeah, most definitely. And I think that this is to the point is that basically cities are competing with one another, right? So who they attract, what kind of characteristics they are able to incorporate into their city makes them more marketable. So yeah, most definitely. Thanks for your feedback. So part of the article also talks about democracy and territorial politics. So politics is not outside of it, it's fully intertwined in this dynamic. So she talks about atypical politics that are involved. So usually involves elected officials and interests, like, sorry, let me go back. So politics usually involves like elected officials and specific interest groups. And in this dynamic that we're talking about, we add judges, the federal government, state and local powers. This federalism is more than just a structural system. It creates its own political dynamic. They are not as directly influenced by constituents, but operational policies are linked to intergovernmental politics affecting government interests. These influences set their own parameters. This changes the taxpayers to ratepayers. So one of the things also, there's 3 important features of this dynamic. And Spreglia talks about horizontal politics. So the competition between the economic growth between states and local governments. So we just talked about this, right? Making each city more profitable to attract the most amount of business in order for their financial gains. The other part is intergovernmental politics in the area of economic policy based on federal and subnational perspectives. So the federal government considers priorities from a macroeconomic perspective versus subnational governments consider based on their territories. So what is most advantageous to their specific area? And this affects the way what they think is appropriate. So I thought that was important as well. And the third is that conflict encourages cities to find ways to increase their discretion. So they are always trying to find the loophole, a creative avenue that is innovative compared to other cities to position themselves with greater advantage. They often seek court support to stretch their bounds. So whenever there's a gray area, sometimes they require court support. But again, the federal government usually uses tax laws and mandates to keep them under control. So in conclusion, governments are central actors of politics of federalism. They act as interest groups, they drive the political process, introduce new actors, strategies, they create and sustain public-private networks, they use judicial interventions and other important functions, and they serve other important functions, roles, and actions. It is part of a highly complex system with a multitude of private and public influences. Opportunities or methods of circumvention are ever-changing with its roots in historical and economic changes. It creates the dynamic nature of the federal system. The dynamic plays a key role in intergovernment politics of local capital investments with the parameters established. Understanding these collectively sheds light on this invisible phenomenon within our local communities. And that's it for me. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Heidi. Excellent work. It's a very layered, very in-depth article, and you did a wonderful job discussing it. Thank you for everyone for participating. It was a good, comprehensive discussion. And it is a difficult article, but I think you handled it with ease. And I think what the author certainly is talking about this whole idea, as you mentioned, of limitations being placed upon local governments, and then local governments trying to circumvent those limitations. It's kind of what we refer to as the paradox of tighter control, that the more you have the national government exert these controls on state or local governments, the more effort and the more resources state and local governments will put into trying to circumvent those rules. And so once they come up with these entrepreneurial, these innovative ways to circumvent the limitations, then the national government will come up with more ways of trying to limit those new entrepreneurial methods. And so one of the reasons why we saw the national government trying to place these limitations upon state and local governments, especially in the area of municipal debt, was that a lot of states were competing against each other, as Heidi had mentioned, competing against each other for tax base. And so they're competing against each other for attracting corporations and attracting industry. So one of the tools that they could use in order to attract corporations was municipal debt, public debt. And we know whenever governments issue debt, whenever they borrow money, they are competing against corporations in the private sector that are also issuing their own debt. Corporations in the private sector can usually pay a higher return on the debt and offer a higher return on the debt to investors than what investors can get out of public debt. So in order to be competitive, public debt needs to have a couple of things to make them competitive. One thing that makes public debt competitive is that you have much less risk associated with municipal debt than you oftentimes see with private sector debt, because you have these things called general obligation bonds. And as we know, general obligation bonds pledge the full faith and credit of the government to repay the debt. And so it's a very low risk type of investment. We know that there is this relationship between risk and reward. And so the lower the risk, the lower the expected reward on the part of investors. And so it becomes a cheaper type of investment for a cheaper type of debt for the government to issue. Then we also know that municipal debt, for many, many years, the interest that investors earned on that debt, that interest was exempt from federal income taxation. This goes back to that principle of reciprocal tax immunity that we got first from the McCulloch versus Maryland case all the way back in 1819. So for many, many years, if a municipality was issuing debt, that debt, the interest earned on the debt would then be exempt from federal income taxes. The problem was that in this competition for industry, in this competition for corporations to come into their jurisdiction, you had states that got really entrepreneurial and really creative with the types of public debt that they were issuing. And so you had the issuance of these things called industrial development bonds, or IDBs. Industrial development bonds were being used, the proceeds of those bonds were being used to provide infrastructure to attract corporations into their jurisdiction. So it was a public debt, but it was being used, the proceeds from the debt were being used for private sector types of activities. Congress continued throughout the 1950s and the 1960s and into the 1980s, little by little, trying to chip away at the use of these industrial development bonds until eventually in 1986, we get this comprehensive piece of legislation called the Tax Reform Act. And we're all most familiar with the Tax Reform Act in terms of what it did to the federal income tax system, in that it reduced the number of income tax brackets, it reduced income tax rates. It was a whole-scale change to the way in which the federal income tax worked. But another part of the Tax Reform Act that's much more germane for our discussion tonight was Congress began to allow, or potentially to allow, for the taxation of certain types of public debt. So not to make this a municipal debt discussion too much, but essentially what Congress did is it created two different categories of debt. It created public purpose and private purpose debt. Public purpose debt would still remain tax exempt. And so if you had something such as debt that was being issued for the purpose of building a city hall, that was considered to be a public purpose. And so the interest on that debt would still remain tax exempt. However, if you had private activity, something that was being funded, and there were formulas, we won't go into all of them, but for example, if 10% of the proceeds were being used in a private business activity, then that would be considered private activity debt, and that debt was not necessarily tax exempt. So what they did is Congress established limitations for each state in terms of the amount of private activity debt that interest could remain tax exempt on. So you finally really had a tangible chipping away at the tax exempt status of municipal debt. Then 2 years later, in 1988, there's a famous Supreme Court case called South Carolina versus Baker. And in South Carolina versus Baker, you had a situation where the Supreme Court sanctioned the ability of Congress to take away the tax exempt nature of interest earned on public debt. And so you had this gradual eroding until now there is no blanket provision that interest earned on public debt would remain tax exempt, remain exempt from federal income taxation. So as you have all these limitations that the federal government starts handing down to state and local governments in terms of their ability to issue debt, then those subnational governments have to start getting creative with how they issue that debt. Also, from the state to local level, you also have a lot of state limitations and regulations on the ability of local governments to issue debt. And so you have things such as a debt limit that is applied to general obligation debt. So there's only so much general obligation debt that local governments can issue. It's usually expressed as a percentage of their revenue. And so you can only issue up to a certain percentage of your overall revenue in general obligation debt. So governments then, local governments had to find a way around traditional debt issuance. And so what they did is they came up with a lot of creative debt issues. So we ended up with a lot more revenue bonds. We ended up with capital appreciation bonds. We ended up with sale leaseback bonds and lease rental bonds and all these different permutations of different types of debt that could circumvent some of these limitations on the issuance of general obligation debt. And then they also, as Spraja tells us in the article, they then entered into these agreements with these public authorities. And so they created these public authorities that could then issue debt outside of these limitations that were placed upon general purpose governments like cities and counties. The concern, as Heidi talks about, that Spraja has in this article, is that once you get that entrepreneurial, Once you then start turning these debt issuing functions over to these authorities, these non-elected authorities, then you have a break in deliberative democracy, because now voters do not have that direct conduit of the ballot box to hold these board members accountable for their actions in issuing debt. I think that argument is truer in other states as compared to here in California. As Daniel pointed out with the example of the housing authority, there is still that conduit between these authorities and elected officials. And I served for a couple of years as a president of a joint finance authority. And this joint finance authority had one member each from the local school districts. So one from my school district, one from the other participating school district. Then we had as other members, we had the superintendents were also members. We had the chief financial officers were also members. So I think we had a total of 5 members, 5 board members. 2 of those board members were elected members of school boards. And so there was still that conduit there, that they were still being held accountable by the voters. So I think here in California, we don't have the same, what she would call Faustian bargain that the subnational governments made that she talks about in the article. And that's one of my favorite quotes from the article, and I'll wrap it up after this, is on page 190, where Spraja says, subnational officials in the United States work within a system in which their predecessors have made Faustian bargains in order to circumvent state restrictions while benefiting from federal tax exemption on local borrowing. They created new governmental entities that qualified for the tax exemption. In doing so, they fragmented their own power. Basically, it became even more fragmented than it was before that. Our federal system was already fragmented. This adds another level of fragmentation to it with what she calls these Faustian bargains. And, you know, a Faustian bargain is a deal with the devil. I don't really know if these are quite as much deals with the devil here in California as perhaps they are in other states. But Sprague's argument here actually launched a whole body of research that started to look at the idea of public authorities and their connection to deliberative democracy. And one very famous author, Eleanor Ostrom, who worked for many years out of Arizona State, actually won a Nobel Prize for some of the work that she did on this idea of the challenge to deliberative democracy presented by these public authorities. But the takeaway from the Spraja article is that we have seen subnational governments try to circumvent limitations by becoming entrepreneurial. And in exchange for getting more flexibility in borrowing money, they perhaps gave up some of their authority and some of their power. And once that authority and that power is given up, it's oftentimes very difficult to then retrieve. So very interesting article. Very nice job by Heidi in leading that discussion. But it is interesting to see just how creative subnational governments feel they have to become to try and circumvent what they consider to be some of these onerous types of rules and limitations that are handed down to them from federal and sometimes state governments in our system of federalism. So I know we have gone past 7:30, and so I think we are overdue for a break. So let's go ahead and take a break until, let's say, 7:50. And when we come back at 7:50, we have 2 more articles we are going to cover tonight. We have the why categorical grants article that we'll cover when we come back from the break. And then the next article we'll do is the financing local government in a changing world by David Bernori. So come on back at 7:50 and we'll finish up our last 2 fiscal federalism articles. All right, everyone, it's 7:50, so we are back from break. And just before we get into our next article, I apologize, Vu, I missed the comment in text chat about the tax exemption and how it was almost eliminated in the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act in 2017. And that's an excellent point. It was very, very close to being eliminated. And governments, the state and local governments really had to basically make a decision between 2 different bad outcomes. One bad outcome was the elimination of interest earned on debt. The other bad outcome was the $10,000 limitation on the SALT deduction. And so they had two things that they were dealing with, and they won on the keeping interest tax exempt. That was a victory for them. They lost on the SALT tax deduction, that we still have that $10,000 cap on state and local tax deduction that's in our federal income tax system. So they won on one and they lost on the other, but that's a very good point. And we'll have to see if maybe this issue rolls around again the next time we have a major set of tax cut legislation. So thank you very much for that. Okay, let's move on to our why categorical grants article, and that's from our good friends at the now defunct U.S. Advisory Commission on Intergovernmental Relations, and that one belongs to Claudia.
Thank you. Let me share my screen. Okay. Is it showing the full presentation now?
Yeah, we're seeing the presentation, then we can see also the next slide that's coming up. So,
Oh, wrong screen. Hold on. Let me see. Share screen two. What about now?
looks good.
Okay. Perfect. Thank you. Okay, so I am presenting on the article Why Categorical Grants by the U.S. Advisory Commission on Intergovernmental Relations. Okay, and then this is just a brief agenda of what we'll be going over from the article. So defining categorical grants. So before discussing the article's context, I think it's important to briefly define categorical grants again. So categorical grants are targeted funds the federal government provides to state or local governments for specific and narrow purposes. These grants come with very strict guidelines on how the money can be spent, ensuring that it is used for designated programs such as special education for low-income student populations, healthcare, or transportation. Unlike other grants, like Dr. Powell mentioned, such as block grants, categorical grants do not have as much flexibility in areas like resource allocation, as they're intended to achieve very particular outcomes set by the federal government. So to start the discussion, has anyone here worked with a categorical grant before or currently? And if so, could you share the name of the grant and its specific purpose? And if not, I do have some examples from my workplace at the Los Angeles County Office of Education. One specific example from there is Medicaid, also known as Medi-Cal in California, which provides funding for health services to designated low-income populations. So here specifically at LACO, we're familiar with the school-based Medi-Cal administrative activities program for federal reimbursements. And just to really show how specific these categorical funds are, it is reimbursement funds just for the administrative activities related to Medi-Cal services. So that means, pre and post notes of like speech therapy sessions, or getting together the referral, or what else, like things of that sort. And then they have to be in 15-minute increments. So very specific to a particular student population, and a particular activity, and also the length of the activity itself. Other examples are Title I funding for education, which is a program that allocates federal funds for local education agencies with high percentages of low-income students. And another example that we're pretty familiar with at LACO is Head Start programs. So they're designed to fund early childhood education and other related services to early education for low-income families. Okay. Okay, so again, the article focuses on categorical grants and starts by speaking on the role of American federalism in the expanding system of categorical grants. Its purpose is to answer this question, which is why was the development of the American federal system characterized by the extensive use of categorical assistance programs rather than by alternative federal state local relationships. This article attributes the preference of categorical grants in within American federalism to three key factors: economic and fiscal considerations, constitutional and philosophical traditions of the US, and features of the decision-making process in the American political system. So regarding economic and fiscal considerations, the article really focuses on spillovers that occur in many state and local government services as a primary reason for developing categorical grants. And spillovers or externalities are benefits from public programs that are not necessarily restricted to the residents of the local jurisdiction that finances them through taxes. So some examples of spillovers are wastewater treatment, where the beneficiaries of cleaner water often extend local jurisdictions. I think in a previous presentation, highway maintenance was also provided as an example, which can benefit non-residents in large volume traffic areas. There's also higher education, where community preparedness and workforce readiness are thought to extend local boundaries, and parks such as regional parks can also attract visitors from other neighborhoods, not just the local neighborhood it resides in. The downfall of spillovers is that local taxpayers may be reluctant to cover the total cost of these services that benefit others outside their local jurisdiction. Sorry. And therefore, the article really emphasizes on the need for federal funding to address the spillovers, and then therefore the preference for categorical grants as a practical solution to spillovers. They're seen as a solution, as mentioned, because these grants allow the federal government to cover a share of the costs of state and local government programs based on the extent of the benefits that its population receives from the specific services. And although the article highlights that this theory is accepted by many experts in finance, it also states that it's subject to criticism by highlighting some arguments from Charles L. Schultz, an economist, who pretty much said that categorical grants are not actually based on the externality principle as intended, but rather prioritizes services that allow federal oversight and direct influence over state and local policies, which leads to not effectively addressing spillovers. Other critiques include the federal government making contributions for externalities where benefits are already confined to their local community already, like local police protection, and should instead contribute to substantial externalities like education and welfare, because not doing so leads to underfunding of programs with widespread societal benefits, which then reduces funding efficiency. For constitutional and philosophical traditions, the article highlights pretty much how American federalism and the US Constitution empower the federal government to maintain oversight and control over state and local programs through financial incentives, which is where, again, the categorical grants come in, as they enable federal support in locally administered programs that align with national objectives. The article also really focuses on the idea that American political patterns and institutions really influence the political decision-making process and the preference for categorical grants. It mentions that influences are found in 4 key areas, which are the operation of interest groups, attitudes of federal distrust of state and local governments, congressional structure and procedures, and lastly, the social and political diversity of the US population, which the article refers to as social pluralism. So for interest groups, the article really hones in on the observations about interest group activities conducted by Philip Moneypenny. Through Moneypenny's observations, he found that the growing categorical grant system largely failed to satisfy the textbook justification for federal funding to provide fiscal equalization among states and address policy needs, but instead also reflects the influence of interest groups navigating the political landscape to achieve their own goals and push their agendas. Meaning, rather than categorical grants being purely based on economic efficiency or the externality principle or spillovers, their development is often shaped by political pressures received by interest groups. Moneypenny argues that when interest groups lack enough power to achieve their objectives at either the state level or Congress, they'll leverage categorical grants that combine federal funding and state administration to meet diverse constituent interests and alleviate political pressures. For federal distrust, the article explains how categorical aid programs are preferred by federal officials due to their concerns about the effective use of funds by state and local governments. There are two key perspectives presented in the article regarding the federal government's preference for categorical grants. One of them is a moderate view, so the federal control of taxation and expenditure, and the thought that federal control of taxation and expenditure enhances accountability, or the belief that funds should be controlled by the government that raises them to emphasize accountability. However, there's also a deeper distrust regarding the intentions and capabilities of state and local governments, and this is federal distrust or the skepticism regarding state, municipal, and counties' intentions, performance, and general competence. To support this reasoning, the article does call on a lot of different individuals and occurrences in history. The article presents the Kesbaum Commission findings of 1955, which highlighted the necessity for accountability through categorization in federal aid, allowing for improved tracking and evaluation of the effectiveness of each categorical grant to provide greater confidence to the federal government that funds are used to support their key priorities. Dr. Goldberg, a congressional committee professional staff member, further supports this argument from a legislative perspective by stating that categorical grants provide better oversight than broader purpose grants, ensuring that Congress can ascertain how the funds are used and who benefits from them. It's this whole idea that broad purpose grants with few conditions can lead to federal support for ineffective programs. And Wilbur J. Cohen, a former secretary of the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, in an interview in 1972, criticized local governments for inefficiency and reliance on political machines, and argued that the federal intervention is necessary so that timely and effective action can occur on pressing social issues. Furthermore, as mentioned, historically, the article highlights criticisms of state and local governments that have led to the reliance on federal intervention in critical areas like civil rights. It references the Great Society era, which favored federally funded services provided through limited purpose governments and private nonprofit organizations, so bypassing traditional state and local systems. Regarding the Great Society, the article references Grodzin's analysis, which points out that states can lose power in both contexts, meaning when the federal government creates a national program based on successful state initiatives, they can lose power, or when it fills gaps left by lagging state efforts. Okay, so considering these points and judgments presented on federal distrust influencing this preference for categorical grants, in what ways do you think federal distrust of state and local governments shapes the effectiveness of categorical grants in addressing community needs? If anybody would like to share their thoughts. Amanda, thank you.
Well, I always think of like when people aren't directly affected or dealing with, like, let's say it's grants that are like maybe funding housing assistance or meant for lower income communities that need additional resources. Like people that don't directly experience those things or have that effect question, I think, how much money is being diverted to those places. They don't fully understand like why things cost as much as they cost, or like why you just like a lot of questions about like why do we need that? That feels like a lot of money we're spending. Like we get that on much more benign things in government, like when it comes to like events. Like people just don't understand how much things cost. So ultimately, like if the people that feel like they're funding these things through their taxes, even if that's not really how it works, like question why we're diverting funds toward that, it just kind of erodes the ability of communities to like effectively address those things, I think. And it's hard to also educate people on those things at the same time. Like, so I think it's just a general like mistrust that then leads to people not trusting their own governments to, efficiently handle those things, which there are, rational or like understandable issues with bureaucracy. Like obviously I work for a government, I see it all the time, but I also know like how much good we do. So that can be frustrating.
Yeah, thank you. I definitely think awareness can help trust on the community level as well, different levels of government. Thank you. Dana?
Oh, hello, everyone. So I was thinking more federal distrust of state and local governments. I think it's kind of similar to what Amanda was saying, the allocation of how those funds are being used, which is why I think when they give grants, they do a lot of auditing. I think when you just in listening to this and what comes to mind, one of the things that I had a discussion today with respect to a lot of the COVID funding that was given, specifically related to testing or vaccinations, I do recall there were some agencies that weren't utilizing money for that. They were utilizing, it was going through the health plan, which was, also a violation. But I think it's kind of that similar, the distrust of transparency that the funding is not utilized for the purposes intended. That's kind of my thought on that issue.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. Actually, that's something that I also noted through my own experience with working with grants. It's just I noticed that when there's federal distrust, there may be more conditions, whether it's through auditing, as you mentioned, or pre and post award status updates if it's an awarded grant. And based on my experience at the Los Angeles County Department Parks and Rec Grants Unit, we often skipped grant opportunities, categorical grant opportunities, if we knew it had a large administrative burden on our team, since we were a small team. And so then, of course, that affects Parks and Rec's Parks and Rec's effectiveness in addressing community needs. So just knowing that there's that administrative burden that may be trickling down from federal distrust kind of drifted us from applying to these grants when our communities really need them. Maria?
I was just gonna say like that when it comes to the stress of the state and local government, some things can be like limited engagement and accountability concerns. such as communities that distrust government may be less likely to participate in programs or initiatives funded by categorical grants, leading to lower enrollment and engagement levels. And as far for like accountability concerns, when citizens doubt the government's accountability, they may demand more oversight and transparency, which can slow down implementation and create bureaucratic hurdles.
Yeah, definitely. I also think, yeah, there are a lot of bureaucratic hurdles, especially if the conditions, again, due to federal distrust, are more rigid, and so maybe it requires more approvals or oversight even from a local level. So thank you all for sharing that. Okay, so now I will go over how congressional influence shapes the use of categorical grants. And so the article explains how this congressional structure, particularly legislative specialization, deference, and log rolling, supports the use of categorical grants. And legislative specialization encourages the heavy use of categorical grants because specialization enables power to be concentrated with committees and subcommittees, which allow individual members to become experts in specific policy fields. So deference then accompanies legislative specialization because members become, as I mentioned, experts in their specified policy fields in these committees and subcommittees, and other members often rely on their colleagues' expertise to inform them of their personal positions or judgments, or choose to remain silent if they have any opposing position to the expert, which is what the article pretty much states about that. Log rolling further encourages the use of categorical grants as congressional members pursue committee assignments that align with their constituents' interests to support their reelection efforts. So pretty much creating this mutual support or dependency. The article, however, also highlights the consequences of this congressional structure, including duplication or conflicting priorities of categorical grants due to decision making being made at the committee level. In addition, legislative reforms such as the 1946 Reorganization Act have further empowered subcommittees, resulting again in overlapping jurisdictions and isolated decision making. And lastly, the article mentions formation of iron triangles or emergence of subgovernments, the collaboration among subcommittees, other executive agencies, and interest groups, which can lead to outcomes that diverge from the congressional intent. Okay, so moving with that, how do you think the structure and specialization within Congress affect the effectiveness of categorical grants in addressing community issues? So specifically just the congressional structure. Does anybody have any thoughts? I think it was Amanda might have touched on it a little bit where, for instance, when I think about it, that Congress members are focused on specialized areas, so they might have a deeper understanding of those particular issues their constituents face, but because they're not in other committees or subcommittees as experts, they might overlook broader community needs or innovative solutions. So for example, if a subcommittee is heavily focused on healthcare grants, they might create programs for local health issues, but miss those that interact with education.
Hey,
Also,
Claudia.
Claudia, I was just thinking about, you know, the differences between urban and rural needs here. So if you're thinking about people that are highly specialized, many of our congressional leaders are coming from you know, areas that are different demographically, and so just thinking about if someone came from a very rural area, the kind of categorical grants they're going to be looking for are not going to be things that are also applicable to people in urban areas, and the other way around.
Yes, definitely. Thank you. Jeremy, sorry, I think your hand just appeared. I saw it and then.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to add that I think Chris mentioned it in another discussion, the fact that sometimes federal grants are too broad just because of their lack of knowledge in these kinds of issues or the like specific needs that the categorical grant might be helping with. So I would imagine if it's somebody in Congress who's at least more involved in that work day to day or is familiar with it, then you would hope they're making like requirements that are reasonable or that within the means that make sense for that specific grant.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Boo?
I was gonna say the partisan nature of Congress in general. You got different sides, and sometimes they're pushing their own agenda, obviously, to get their own vote. So just the makeup of Congress in general, I think will affect how the grants are being distributed.
Yeah, definitely. I think that was something that I mentioned in my article critique is just the polarization that we see today. Esmeralda?
Yes, I just want to piggyback on what Boo mentioned, and then you also touched up upon it. I feel that a lot of there is no state that is similar. They're all different. They might have similar elements, but these grants are made so they're broad and each state can kind of apply it to what their specific needs are. And it is a bipartisan issue as well. So I think it's intentional, kind of to keep some sense of unity, uniformity on the federal perspective, but also giving each state, a voice and choice in what their constituents need.
Thank you. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it's yet cities aren't even neighboring cities aren't very similar, yet alone states. So definitely that's the consideration that is probably hindering state and local governments from addressing community issues. Something else that I see at work in regards to these committees and categorical grants being created that have overlapping priorities, specifically in education, is that we have to be very mindful of federal funding double dipping. So, as you know, you can't receive federal funds for a particular service from two different programs, because then it's considered double dipping into federal funds. So we have to be very mindful and very strategic in planning how to optimize the categorical grant opportunities that we're presented with, just so that we can maximize as much as the funding to meet community needs. So again, because of that overlap, it does require us to be strategic in what grants we're going to use for what particular programs and services. Thank you, everyone, for your insights. Okay, and then finally, the article highlights social pluralism, or again, the U.S. Cultural and economic diversity as impacting the preference for categorical grants. And this is because the United States is, again, very diverse, and national consensus on major policy changes is very rare and difficult to achieve. Supporting Gary Orfield, an analyst of Congress, the article argues that Congress favors the demands for new categorical grants over broad policy changes to maintain constituent support without substantial opposition, which I think Dr. Powell mentioned earlier today. So they'll favor, just creating a new categorical grant over any substantial policy changes that may receive backlash. And then one of the prime examples the article provided for this is education. So with numerous categorical programs developed throughout the decades, it illustrates federal challenges in pretty much achieving a cohesive educational support system. Continuous issues such as religion and education also further complicate the political landscape, and creating categorical grants helps bypass some of these issues. Then they reference, or the article references, the 1965 Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which is an example provided again, like by the article, to show how social pluralism facilitates the passage of comprehensive legislation that encompasses multiple distinct programs. So this particular act included 5 titles addressing various educational needs: aid for education and disadvantage, funding for textbooks and libraries, the establishment of supplementary education centers for adults and children, development of national network of regional educational laboratories, and assistance in strengthening state education departments. And so this was the U.S. Commissioner of Education, Francis Keppel, had a key role in navigating these complex interests for this act. So it highlights that particular example in the article. Okay, so challenges of categorical grants today. So while the article presents a foundational argument for the dominance of categorical grants, it fails to consider some of the contemporary dynamics. The article was written a while back, which raises questions about the validity of its conclusions. So the conclusion of the article being that categorical grants are is a practical solution to address spillovers is what's a little bit in question. The article rightly notes that spillovers are a significant factor for categorical grants. However, it overlooks the rigid compliance requirements that often hinder local governments' effectiveness, which we've discussed throughout this presentation. So although categorical grants allowed local governments to rapidly deploy resources during, as an instance, as COVID-19 pandemic, if we're looking specifically into this example, the inflexible rules and, either resource allocation limited the ability of even agencies like legal to very quickly relocate the federal funds in urgent needs. So it could have been slightly quicker, even though it was pretty speedy. Additionally, the administrative burden, I think I mentioned earlier, of applying for and managing these grants often, scares smaller organizations from pursuing necessary funding, which counters the original intent of these programs. So agencies are missing opportunities to provide more efficient service delivery if they don't have the sufficient staff to meet all their documentation compliance requirements. Moreover, the article does not adequately address how the one-size-fits-all nature of categorical grants, which I think Esmeralda and I want to say Amanda mentioned as well, that they have very narrow objectives and priorities, which may not fit every state or city and their community needs. So that's another thing that the article failed to address, is just that categorical grants are not always tailored to reflect the diverse demographics of communities. There was a recent study that I noted, which included it pretty much conducted a study on the effects of categorical grants on community colleges throughout California, and actually found that categorical grants can exacerbate existing disparities, particularly in under-resourced educational institutions, stating that better resourced institutions continue to receive funding and support, which raises equity concerns. So this whole priority of equity that's been arising in the recent years also comes into play, that needs to be updated in the article. And lastly, the article, I think Vu mentioned, right, is it needs to be updated to include the impact of political polarization today on the acceptance and implementation of federal funding. So there are many critiques on how partisan divisions lead to inconsistencies in implementing categorical grants. So it's known that, certain states, if they don't agree with the national objectives, they may reject implementing the funding or the programs, which results in funding disparities that amplify further amplifying inequities. And to end our discussion, I would just like to ask one final time, just overall, how do you think categorical grants impact the ability of your agency to address contemporary community needs, whether it be positive or negative?
I can add on to this one. I think that they are overall pretty helpful. I mean, I'd rather have them than not have them at all. Of course, they have their own challenges, but I would say like we are very dependent on some of them. So I think that like they could be improved in specific, like they could be improved, but I think it's also unrealistic to be like, all right, we need these types of grants to fit everyone's needs for all the local municipalities. So I almost feel like they're okay, like they could be improved, but also like you can't really make them universally perfect for everyone.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think, LACO really does utilize categorical grants a lot. And so again, what we do is just more of a strategic planning approach to really optimize the funds as much as we can. And we also utilize lobbying efforts as well to really advocate for LACO's priorities, especially when we know new categorical grants or funding is going to be available in the near future. Yeah, but if there's nothing else, that pretty much concludes my presentation. So thank you everyone for participating.
Thank you very much, Father. Very well done. It's very comprehensive, and a lot of ground is covered by the ACIR in the article. And I think you hit all the very important points of the article. And it is interesting that if we look at the timing of when categorical grants became very popular, we do see this confluence of all these different factors kind of flowing together, kind of in a a garbage can model decision making type of approach. And the confluence of the factors, as Claudia mentioned, the Legislative Reorganization Act, which then empowered committees in Congress. Then in the 1960s and the 1970s, we had what were called the Hansen Amendments in the House and the Stevenson Amendments in the Senate that then empowered subcommittees and provided subcommittees with their own jurisdictions over certain areas of legislation. So it even went beyond the fragmentation of committees and further fragmented Congress into subcommittees. And so when you have that fragmentation, the structure of Congress, that fragmentation leads to specific types of grants like categorical grants. And then overlaid on top of that, you had the Johnson administration, and as Claudia had also mentioned, the Great Society, the expansion of civil rights legislation with the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the Fair Housing Act of 1968, Equal Employment Opportunity Act of 1972, the expansion of affirmative action through the series of executive orders throughout the Kennedy and Johnson and Nixon administrations. And you have all of this civil rights legislation that then creates the situation where you have southern states that are some southern states being very resistant to that civil rights legislation, which then leads to a lot of distrust where the national government is no longer having trust that the state governments are going to promote these national objectives of civil rights legislation. And so if you don't trust subnational governments, then you want to compel their action. And one way to compel their action, not only through mandates, which we'll talk about next week, but also through these categorical, very specific types of grants. So you had that happen. Then also as a result of the Vietnam War, you then had a situation where people start to lose faith in their political parties. And when people stopped having faith in their political parties, then they had to find representation elsewhere. And it's not coincidental that in the wake of the Vietnam War, we see this great expansion in the number and the activity of interest groups. And so now we have all these interest groups that are descending upon Congress and trying to lobby for certain types of pieces of legislation. So you have that also occurring. Then in addition to that, you then also have a situation where you not only have these interest groups, you not only have the Legislative Reorganization Act and all these committees and all these subcommittees, You not only have this distrust that's coming from the federal government looking at what southern states are doing in terms of trying to slow down the implementation of civil rights, you've got all this flowing together at the same time that you also have a heightened interest in environmental protection. And that when you have that heightened interest in environmental protection, then you're introducing this idea of spillovers that Claudia talked about as well. And the more spillovers you have, then the more justification you have for these categorical grants. So I think it's a really interesting article that I think the answer is it's all of the above, that all of these factors came together at a certain point in time that then contributed to the development of these categorical grants. You then add into that the re-election prospects of members of Congress and how members of Congress, in order to get re-elected, will go out there and want to claim credit for things. Well, how can you claim credit for things? These categorical grants. And so I think all of that flowed together to give us those categorical grants. The very good question that Claudia posed to us is the question we have to ask with all of these articles. How can we then update these articles? These articles were written a few decades ago. How can they be updated to what's happening today? We certainly still see categorical grants used today, but because we're in our era of contextual federalism, it's a much more issue-based decision about when to use categorical grants versus when to use block grants. When the national government has a well-specified national objective that it wants to try and to achieve, then a categorical grant would probably work better than a block grant. However, we have seen the replacement of categorical grants with block grants, not just because of ideological issues, but also because of the success of state governments in using waivers. And later on, we'll read an article about federalism by waiver that will talk to us about how state governments lobbied the federal government to get these waivers to federal regulations that would free them up and allow them to try new creative and innovative approaches to implementing policies. And then as those policy approaches worked, then we saw them start to be adopted by the national government. So in terms of the waivers, when the waivers were granted, they were oftentimes funded with these block grants, more general types of grants to give state governments that flexibility. But then once states start to have success and Congress decided, well, we're going to then mandate this across the entire country, then those block grants suddenly start to be transformed into categorical grants. So again, it's kind of an all the above type of answer. There's no one single answer as to why we have categorical grants. But the one thing we do know from the combination of the Moneypenny article and this ACIR article is that there are certainly a lot of political imperatives that contribute to the use of categorical grants in our system of American federalism. And I will shut up now and stop talking. Okay, let's then move to our final article of the night, which is Financing Local Government in a Changing World by David Bernori, and that one belongs to Amanda. So Amanda, the floor is yours.
Okay, let me get my presentation going. Okay, so can everyone hear me, and can you see my presentation in presentation mode?
Yes and yes.
Great. Okay, so this chapter is going to kind of touch on a lot of things that we've already touched on, but this is going to be more specifically in terms of local government authority in terms of taxing as a source of revenue for their operations. So Brunori kind of starts off this article talking about some of the existing challenges that local governments are facing and have been facing, and then it's going to kind of move into some of those future challenges. So to kind of start off, obviously, people have the ability to move around. So cities in general have to act kind of competitively when it comes to tax burdens that they place on individuals and businesses. So already there is some limitation there in terms of they want to foster an environment where businesses and individuals want to come to your cities to do their business and then give you a source of revenue to use. So there already is kind of that limitation of being competitive and not wanting to have too high a tax burden on those people. The article also goes into the tax revolts of the 1970s and the 1980s, that led to some kind of constitutional restructuring of the authority of local governments to tax individuals and businesses. So there was additional limitations placed there. Also, just in general, living in this country, I think it's something that we've all heard, in regards to some tax or another, but just a general and bias for all levels of government, right? Like there are people that are libertarian that think that taxation is theft in general. And then there's people that more strongly contest certain taxes like personal income tax and property tax. So just a general anti-tax bias that kind of has always festered, but then obviously we're going to go into a little bit some more specifics in terms of anti-tax bias with some of those specific property taxes specifically. And then just some kind of existing limitations on things like sales tax. That's kind of a shrinking base in terms of, a reliable source of income for local governments. As I mentioned, personal income tax has a lot of political opposition. And then business tax, which we will also get into a little bit more later, but in terms of being kind of a mobile base, can get harder and harder to tax. So historically has not been considered a viable source of government revenue. But, I think we're going to get into it, is becoming a harder and harder source of revenue to rely on because of the way businesses are run now. So it kind of goes into then some of the future changes that we kind of can predict are coming that are going to affect the ways that local governments finance themselves. So the kind of first challenge we're going to go over is globalism. Obviously, we are becoming more and more connected. It's easier to move around. Trade is increasing, so we're just a lot more in general connected. It's increasing that mobility of businesses and people, and that's just going to continue to make it harder to tax those things. And then technological advancements are changing the way we do business. They're changing the way we move about and communicate with each other. Deregulation of specific industries is also changing our ability to rely on traditional sources of tax income. And then an aging population is also affecting, which we'll get into, but specifically property tax and the ability to rely on that as a sustainable source. And one of the article's quotes that I kind of liked was, in a different time for a different economy, like specifically the structures that we've created as ways to finance local government were created in a very different time when we did business differently. And those things haven't really changed a whole heck of a lot since then. And so it kind of is natural that we're having issues now, that we're not collecting as much revenue and they're not just functioning the way they used to. And it was kind of interesting. The article goes into specifically like sales tax, when that was first introduced, was supposed to be just a temporary revenue builder from after the Great Depression. So it wasn't, I guess, at the start intentionally meant to be a permanent source of revenue. Income taxes came along not long after that. Property tax was first brought about during colonial America. So everything's kind of come from different times, but again, nothing's really changed with the way they're enacted. And obviously things are very different now than colonial times. So the kind of main, I think, conclusion that we're going to draw from this is we definitely need to work on creating changes to these policies if we're going to expect to use them as sustainable sources of income. But, we'll get into that a little bit later. So the first section or first challenge that the article goes into is globalism. And another kind of snippet that I liked from this article was talking about how there was a report that came out from the National League of Cities that basically said an American city now may conduct more trade with Hong Kong than a direct neighbor, which is, crazy to think about in terms of when you think of like trade and the way people did business not that long ago. Like, we were very limited in terms of where we were getting products and how things were moving. And now, I live in Long Beach next to, I don't know the exact specifications, but probably I would assume one of the largest ports in the country. So it's insane to think of the amount of stuff that just comes through those places from all over the world that, 100 years ago, it was incomparable. So a general increase in international trade, which is attributable to increases in individual and capital mobility. So, our ability to move about the world more easily, and then also kind of, we'll get into this later, but the advent of the internet and the ability to like move resources like money around more easily. We're not tied to cash. You can do things online, transactions online. So that's kind of changed how trade has functioned. And these things have a major influence on the scope of personal income tax, sales tax, and business tax. So when you kind of break down those things, like a lot of those taxes are very dependent on physical location, to help dictate, how much money we're bringing in from those things. So like income tax, that's going to be imposed based on where someone lives. Business taxes can be, something in regards to like where the location of a sale is made, or it can also affect like where the operations of the business are happening, if they have a plant, if they have an office building. And then obviously along with that, like property taxes. Sales and use tax, again, also comes back to where sale takes place, or where that service is being consumed. And then I already kind of talked about it, but property taxes in general, it's really just, you have to have a physical main location. And when people are moving around so much, that really erodes the ability of that tax base to be a sustainable source of income. So there's kind of two main issues that the article goes into that globalism has kind of created, or that are like kind of causing issues with these tax bases. So the first one is going to be because, and I kind of mentioned it a little bit previously, but cities, particularly like local governments, they need to be competitive with other cities, to kind of attract foreign nations to come, and whether it's through business, whether it's through people, to come do business in those places. So, it's now become, it's not just you're trying to, and I'll go into kind of like a personal example with my own city, but you're not just trying to function and like maintain the status quo. You're also thinking of the future and like how you're going to continue to fund your operations. And a lot of that now for cities comes down to attracting outside businesses, sometimes foreign business, into your cities. And so therefore, cities might become more invested in specifically international economic development activities. Like in my city, a lot of our general revenue fund comes from our hotel tax. So we have we have pretty large hospitality and tourism industry. We're right next to Disneyland. We're not that far from Knott's Berry Farm. There's a lot of theme parks. So a major component of our city's economic development plan is those hotels. Our next one coming out, on which I don't think they've broken ground yet, but I could be wrong on that, is like a new Nickelodeon hotel that they're building, which I had no idea Nickelodeon was still kind of in that cultural zeitgeist where that would be something popular, but that is like an exciting new hotel development that the city has been kind of hyping up for the last couple of years, and that's finally starting to move. And I would imagine there are foreign interests in investing in hotel and tourism industry. So that's a good example kind of like of a city that's actively pursuing those opportunities to bring those businesses in. And let's see. And so with that kind of like increased competition, that might start affecting, if you want to have a lower tax burden for those businesses, like, yes, you're going to be attracting businesses into your community, but then you're also, by lowering their tax burden, lowering your potential revenue that you're going to get from them. So yes, you might be attracting more businesses, but it's kind of eroding that tax base in a way that, we hadn't had before. And then with globalism, there's also just the general proliferation of trade agreements. And, the only way those come about is you're trying to eliminate the barriers to trade. So those agreements that might be dictated by the federal or state governments potentially place limitations on local tax policy as it relates to economic development. So cities might be forced into a tax policy that is more limiting because of trade agreements with these foreign countries. So ultimately, kind of this section of the chapter basically ends with like expanding that international trade has kind of shown that taxation of mobile capital and people is not a very efficient or effective form of financing. So that's going to continue to be a factor as obviously we could become more and more connected, and globalism continues, because there's probably not really a good chance of that slowing down anytime soon. So we're going to get to discussion question number 1. So in your guys' opinion, should local and or state governments offer these kinds of tax incentives and like lowered tax burdens to bring in new business, even if it means less money for public services?
Hey Amanda, I would think so because ultimately if you invest in the businesses, it will generate more like revenue for the city, which would then in turn benefit the civilians and everyone that they serve. So I think like yes, giving up some of it causes a better cause and effect in the very end of it all.
Yeah, totally. I would agree with that. Like I get the idea that you're kind of lowering the ability of that tax base to generate revenue, but without those businesses, like you said, you can't have that revenue coming in. So it is, kind of what's the word I'm looking for? I like a kind of an unintended consequence, but kind of a necessary evil. That's what I was trying to think of. I don't know who was next, but I'm gonna go with Emily, and then we'll do Daniel.
Yeah, I totally agree with what you and Chris were saying also. But then on the flip side, I think it also just depends on the individual city, right? So their specific circumstances. And so that probably is going to require a pretty significant like cost benefit analysis, right? So are the benefits going to outweigh the costs in terms of limiting maybe funds for the public services in order to kind of have the opportunity for the economy to build with the expansion of the new businesses. So it's kind of a toss up, but I totally agree with what you guys are saying too.
Thank you, Emily and Daniel.
Yeah, I was just gonna say that I think it depends on a number of factors. I live here in Inglewood, and this city has given away a lot of money to build first the new SoFi Stadium with the Chargers and the Rams play at, and now they've also built the Intuit Dome, which is where the Clippers are going to play. And obviously, there's tax revenues that are brought in by all the tickets that are sold there at concerts and additional other things. But I think that there's a lot of other downstream tax effects that may actually be going to neighboring cities, through things like where people are eating dinner, where people are going to bars before and afterwards, because Inglewood doesn't necessarily seem to have like the hotels that you would need or the restaurants or the bars that you would need to really maximize on your increases through that. So I just think that there's a lot of things that you'd have to take into account. And I just think that sometimes when you live in a place like Los Angeles, you might be giving some of those tax benefits to nearby cities instead of yourself.
Yeah, and to me, I bet there would also foster some kind of going back to like distrust of your government, like especially for people in Inglewood who maybe, depending on what area in Inglewood you're in, like if you're not able to afford going to these games and you're not kind of reaping those benefits, it's going to be frustrating to see your community kind of investing in these large exterior things that don't seem to benefit you right away. Especially, like I said, if you're not educating the people on what those benefits are, once the football stadium starts functioning and you can kind of put numbers, to illustrate how much it's helping the community. Unless you're doing that legwork to educate the community, they may not necessarily see that and have a different perception of what that outside investment is, actually helping the community. So thank you, everybody. Okay. So the next kind of challenge the chapter goes over is technological advances. And I think, it's easy to say that probably the biggest one is the invention of the internet. And for a lot of different reasons, obviously I don't know about you guys, like Amazon, it's gotten very easy to pretty much conduct all of your business buying and selling online. And because you're buying and selling online, potentially, you live in one state, you're buying a product that is from another state and shipped to you. It just kind of makes it murky in terms of who's getting that sales tax, and is it going to the right state? And it just is reducing the reliability of sales tax as an income source. It also is going to reduce the business tax revenue because, again, business tax revenue is dependent on there being a physical location. So if you're buying from an online business, or maybe like, there's a lot of, I think, proliferation of like drop shippers, where you can, like, almost anyone can start a drop shipping business. And I do not fully understand the the way those work, but it's basically like, I don't even know where you would have your location for drop shipping, because you're almost acting like a third party seller of a product is somewhere else, and then you're going and you're shipping it to someone somewhere else. So there's a lot of locations then involved in that business transaction, right? So it's making that kind of confusing and also making it hard to accurately capture that tax revenue. The article estimates, and this is an old number, so I don't know if, I'm sure there is an updated number somewhere, but in 2001, which was quite a long time ago, the internet has changed a lot since then, the estimated losses for local government, even then, was in the tens of billions of dollars per year. And I am not good at numbers, so I'm not going to try and put that in today money, but that's going to be a lot. So technological advancement of the internet is going to have a huge impact. And then that kind of leads into the next point in this chapter, which is the proliferation of remote work. And obviously, this was before COVID, which that's kind of exacerbated remote work, right? So I'm not some companies and corporations are trying to bring people back into the office to varying degrees of success. But I think, especially post-COVID, remote work is not going anywhere. And if anything, it's going to continue to be kind of like that competitive edge that businesses will use to attract good employees, because it is such a benefit. I know, with my job, I can't work remotely. A lot of it does entail me being in the office, but there is some stuff I could do at home. And if I could even have a day a week to do remote work, that would be a huge benefit for me to stay with the agency that I'm with. So with kind of like that technological advancement of the internet, like I said, and also just laptops and cell phones, it really has allowed people to do the same amount of work, but just from home. So what this can also lead to is it makes it difficult for local entities to rely on wage taxes. And then also employers and employees might be able, I think I left this part of the sentence off the slide, but it makes it easier, I think, or easier to avoid paying the appropriate wage and payroll taxes, because a company might be located in one state, and then you'll have a handful of employees that are operating all out of different states. So again, it's kind of like that confusion with having multiple physical locations, having your home-based business operating in one state and then having employees in other states. So that kind of makes it difficult. And obviously that was not, remote work was not a thing, when policies surrounding business tax were first implemented. So that's going to automatically kind of put that at a disadvantage of being a sustainable revenue source. And then last, for technological advancements, decreases in capital intensive businesses. So a lot of these advancements have allowed modern business to operate with less capital. So they might be find ways to operate more efficiently, which lessens the, how big of a plant they need or the kinds of equipment that they need. So obviously with less plants, or like I said, with remote work, if you have people working remotely, you don't need large office parks to house all your employees. So you're going to have less capital. And if it's, plants or business like sites, then you're going to also decrease your property taxes that local agency might be relying on. And kind of like an added consequence of this is then also the burden of property tax revenue shifts from businesses to residents, which is going to already compound existing issues with property taxes that I will get into later when it comes to kind of the limitations of property taxes and the negative effects it can have on certain groups of people. So then we're going to go on to discussion question number 2. And what are some innovative approaches that cities or municipalities can take to sustain funding when residents or businesses are no longer location dependent? And I know this one's kind of abstract, because I don't know that we've really seen a lot of these new policies go into effect yet, but if anyone has any ideas,
I could
Sure, good. Go ahead, Esmeralda.
I think allowing more like work from home opportunities, maybe having like a flex work schedule, if they're not if they're not dependent on location, that can help save, especially if they're in a different state and taxes and what have you. Also, if they're actually in a building, they have to pay for like water, lights, Wi-Fi, etc., etc. But I think it kind of depends on the state because I remember reading, I think last year that California was trying to minimize the work from home. Because I guess they found that it wasn't as efficient as how those companies would like for it to be. But I think it all has to do with the fact of communication and making sure that, they have their targets and goals and accountability and action plans. But my only concern would be like the drawback was that they were going to attempt to, I guess, cut from people's benefits if they didn't want to abide by like certain hours in the office. I don't know if it ended up going through. I'm assuming not, but I do see like more people kind of slowly transitioning back into the office. But I think it's a good idea to have like flexibility or just work from home if it's possible.
Yeah, I like that point about like maybe those municipalities, if possible, can embrace the remote work element and reduce their own costs by not needing that same physical location dependent like capital, whether it's buildings or equipment. That's something that I think, like my office is very conservative, like I said, with the remote work. So I don't see them doing that anytime soon, but it could be a valuable, option down the road once, they start to see that remote work isn't going anywhere. Heidi?
Yeah, I was thinking back to finance, when we were discussing some of the approaches by cities. And I remember I had come across an article where and even the professor discussed how cities are investing in the stock market, which I thought was interesting because obviously there's risk to that. But that was just one of the different ways that they were thinking outside the box in order to increase their revenue. So I just thought I would mention that.
Yeah, that point came up in some of my research I was doing for the article critique on this is kind of an unusual or not historically used way to fund local government was through using those means, and I agree it is very can be very risky, but depending on how risky those investments are, if you have an agency that's doing very low risk, it might be more of a viable source of income for them. Okay, so the next issue that is brought up in terms of the future is the idea of deregulation, and the chapter kind of splits this into three main issues. So there is this trend towards decreased regulation of utilities. So when industries were more regulated, kind of like our telecommunications and water and electricity utilities like that, they were essentially monopolies, and local governments had this ability to impose higher taxes on them because there was no competition from other lower price competitors. And so now that these kinds of utilities are getting deregulated, there is all of this outside competition from other unregulated businesses. And obviously those utility agencies that were once heavily regulated now are going to obviously want to enjoy those same lower tax burdens that maybe newer utility companies that are entering the marketplace are enjoying, right? So again, it kind of goes back to being competitive. You can't have, a tax burden for one entity and then a different tax burden for another if they're in the same industry, right? So this deregulation of utilities is kind of causing that the need to be competitive with those tax burdens that are placed on those businesses. And then with that kind of increased competition that's been depressing prices, now that we have lower utility prices, it's also led to lowered land value, which then again goes back to decreasing property taxes. So that's kind of an unintended consequence of that deregulation. It also talks about threats to utilities that are owned and operated by local governments. So as much as there is a lot of deregulation happening, there are still agencies that rely on providing utilities as a means of funding their budgets. So for example, in the book, it talks about and again, I don't know currently if this is still the same, but at the time in Tallahassee, Florida, 40% of their budget was derived from the electricity utility that the city provided. And obviously, when you start having deregulation and other entities coming in and being competition, you now have the government is in competition with private sector utilities. So that's going to change again. It's going to lower prices. It's going to lower the revenue that they can bring in through that. And if you have a city like Tallahassee, where like that's a huge percentage of their budget that's relying on that source of income, that's going to be hugely detrimental to their financing ability. And then last but not least, that increased competition from the private sector also alters the right-of-way and franchise fees, which, apart from the tax revenue, those can be a large source of non-tax revenue for cities. So that's another unintended consequence kind of that trend towards deregulation with these utility companies. And then the last kind of major challenge that the chapter goes into is our aging population. So obviously we have declining birth rates, and then also coupled with longer lifespans means we're going to have higher than average ages for adults in America. In 1980, 11% of the population was over the age of 65. And then at the time of publishing, by 2030, projections showed that 20% of the population will be older than 65. So that trend is continuing. And with that, there's this perception that there's kind of like a general animosity towards taxes, and most especially property taxes with senior citizens. And rightfully so, because there's a trend that our real estate values increase faster than income. And when you have a lot of seniors that are living on a fixed income, they can't keep up with that rising real estate value that then is going to impact their property tax. So, and obviously, like there is, especially when you're a senior citizen, you've maybe lived in your home for 40 years, you not only have this like physical tie to your property, that's kind of a huge source of your financial stability at that stage of your life, but then also just the psychological attachment to your house. So it becomes a very highly emotional issue. And then obviously that's going to kind of cause tension when you have people that are potentially at risk of losing their homes at a time when they can't afford to buy back in the market where they are. So there's also the added element that there's the perception that seniors are not public education. And so obviously property taxes tend to fund public education. That's a huge source of their funding. And when you're a senior, you don't have children that are in the public education system. So you don't have that. It kind of goes back to like when people aren't directly affected by a problem, they have a harder time, I think, understanding the value and the benefit of their tax dollars going towards that thing, right? We all kind of have like a narrow view sometimes of like what we want our money to go towards. And so there's this kind of perception that they're not then, because of that association of property taxes with funding public education, that they're not really getting a benefit out of. It's going to kind of add to that animosity that is felt towards property taxes. And then kind of coupled with that, a lot of times these increases in property taxes to help fund public education have to be voted on. And senior citizens make up a large portion of voting Americans. So that's going to obviously also impact the ability of these changes to the policy to increase the budgets of the public education system. So there have been attempts by policymakers to kind of help, because obviously it is a huge issue. It is not fair, to place that much of a burden on seniors with fixed incomes, especially when real estate prices have gotten so high. You want people to be able to stay and live in the homes that they've lived in and not potentially be facing homelessness or financial hardship because of that. So policymakers have tried to lower the tax burden on seniors, but then obviously the caveat of that is because you're lowering their tax burden by providing relief programs, and then you're not also replacing that lost revenue, you're still going to have that situation where the local government is potentially facing a deficit if you're not replacing that revenue source that you're losing. So there is still a need to kind of figure out maybe a better way to implement property tax policy in a way that is equitable for everyone across all ages and is still able to fund local programs. But that's kind of the main issue with the idea of like an aging population that, again, I think we're on track. Birth rates have still stayed low. We're on track to have that trend continue. So it is going to become an issue in the future. So our third question kind of revolves around this. With an aging population, how might local governments adapt property tax policies to remain equitable and sustainable? Does anyone have any? I know this one's kind of tricky because I don't personally know a ton about, progressive tax policies, new ideas regarding tax policies, but I don't know if anyone has ever heard of any proposed changes to that it would in a way would kind of help protect seniors and also, maintain that as a revenue source for our public education system. Lou, go ahead.
I don't know about the tax for different states, Amanda, but for California, especially for my parents, I'm actually happy that Prop 13 is in place. Just because you know for sure what your increase will be like on an annual basis, instead of having the property value assessed at current market value and getting taxed on that. Because if that were the case, I think they'd be in deep doo-doo just because they're on a fixed income. And with the appreciation we've seen so far in the property prices around SoCal, it'd be almost impossible for them to be able to make their property taxes at the fixed income that they're currently getting. So that's just my take on it.
Yeah, and that's great because I think California probably, especially because we just have such a high cost of living and real estate costs here are so high, it probably more directly affects seniors here. So having like propositions like that coming from the state level to help protect them is going to be really important. And those solutions might need to happen more quickly in states like that where it is more of a prevalent issue. Esmeralda, go ahead.
I was actually going to comment on the same proposition. I've looked into it and it is a fixed rate. I think for Pasadena, it's $90 per year. But I think it goes back to like making sure it's equitable for everybody, but also ensuring that people understand what it is exactly, because there's always two sides to the story, and one, I feel like it's the way that they present it on the yes and no is very, they use specific language intentionally. But I do support this one because then it's not like the fee goes up and down. It's 90 and it's to one, ensure that it's equitable for the people paying, but also the people receiving the funds. So yeah.
Yeah, that's a good point about how difficult it can be to understand, like when states on it, offer these new potential adjustments to policy through propositions. Like I can't count how many times I've gone to try and vote and just been really confused about what exactly a proposition was proposing. So that's going to be a hurdle to overcome when it comes to actually changing policy, is having propositions written, excuse me, in a way that is understandable so that people will actually vote for it and not get confused and then just not vote at all or vote no because they don't know what they're voting for. So that's going to, I think, be a big hurdle in making changes to tax policy moving forward. And then I just have one more question to close this out, and it's tried to be a little more general. So given all these changes to local government funding sources, municipalities have had to find new ways to try and recover funds. So can anyone think of any examples of newer funding sources, either within your organization or within maybe the city in which you reside, that you have noticed, maybe increasing, or new fees, things like that, that didn't used to exist that now exist? And if not, I thought of one. Oh, go ahead, Jeremy.
Sure. I mean, it's not, I wouldn't say it's necessarily a positive way to recover funds, but I live in Highland Park and I've lived here for a long time now. And I mean, gentrification. You bring in a bunch of new businesses, you bring in a bunch of new coffee shops, a bunch of new shops, and it little do you know, it brings in more money. Places opening up, more people around. So that, I wouldn't say that's the best way to do it, but that is a way, is just a lot. I mean, offering spaces for new places to come into.
Yeah, and then it's hard because, you know, the gentrification issue, obviously it kind of goes back to, you don't want to price out people that maybe have lived in a community for a very long time. But then there's also those positive elements of bringing in new businesses and bringing in money that's hopefully going to positively impact that community. But I get what you're saying. It is a very like complex issue. It is not black and white or, you know, completely positive. And in my own, like I live in Long Beach, and for anyone that's ever lived here or come here, parking is at a premium. And I feel like, I want to look up our city's budget because not that I think it's a huge source of revenue. I don't think it's making up any one, tax base that might have decreased, but I feel like just in the last 10 years, the amount of paid parking things that have sprung up either within certain areas, like I live downtown, and there are some places that offer, like there is one parking lot I have found that has like free 2-hour parking. But for the most part, you are paying for parking down here. If you live down here, luckily our unit has 2 parking spaces, but I know a lot of people that have lived in downtown and paid like a monthly, like $120 a month to have dedicated parking. And depending on, obviously not all of those maybe are publicly owned, but a lot of the publicly owned ones, those meters, I feel like are newer, or like I know West Hollywood it's a good amount of their money. I don't know if anyone from there knows exactly how much, but it is like a newer, I think, revenue source that, like I said, obviously won't completely replace any of those tax bases, but it does help. Esmeralda.
I was also going to mention the express lane on the freeways. California, I mean, they have a lot and I understand why, but it seems like there's more of the fact that people have to pay for it. I know on the 10, I don't know if maybe anyone's aware, but for the longest time they were working on it and they finally finished, and you can take it, I believe, all the way to, I think, passing Ontario, and they're charging they charge per mile. So like the toll roads, and there's some states that, have very little to none. So jumping back to the other questions, like how equitable is that for people, and if people can't access, those funds, do they have certain programs? But it was just a thought.
That's a great one. I live, like, obviously, like I said, in Long Beach, and they just did the extension of the fast track up the 405, which I have a lot of opinions on because Long Beach is like a weird place where we don't really get to enjoy the benefit of that. It doesn't cut through up to the up the 405, which I'm kind of fine with because I don't intend on using those toll roads. I'll just sit in traffic, but it is interesting because, like, this kind of goes back to when you don't necessarily maybe understand the benefits or get to see the benefits. Like for me, those toll roads, if anything, they have only made my work to home commute worse permanently. So like for me, I'm like, what is the point? This is terrible. I don't care how much new revenue it brings in. It wasn't worth it. Let's rip it back out. But obviously, in some areas that is like a huge way that they fund those infrastructure projects on those highways, and needed because those municipalities that those roads are going through may not have the funds to do those improvements. So it's kind of a double-edged sword there. And that takes us to the end. So thank you very much for indulging me on a conversation about local taxes.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Amanda. Very well done, and great questions and good discussion. Yeah, and kind of pull all this together. As Amanda tells us in this article, we've got all these limitations that local governments have in terms of generating their own source revenue, whether it be from an aging population or from these tax limitations, like Prop 13, to more mobile capital, which is a major problem for a lot of local governments because as this capital becomes more mobile, it's harder to tax. As Amanda points out, the vast majority of our tax structures are predicated upon what's called a situs principle. And the situs principle of taxation means that we kind of tax where the resources are at, tax where the transaction occurs. But the problem is a lot of these corporations are no longer keeping inventory in warehouses. they're doing more on-demand type of sales. And so you no longer have that inventory that you can tax. As you move away from a manufacturing economy, you no longer have the machinery to tax. You just don't have that same tax base. And you have to become more mobile and more agile in the way that you're taxing. One of the saving graces for a lot of state governments has been the Wayfair case, that Supreme Court case that permitted state governments to apply their sales taxes to online transactions, irrespective of whether or not there is a physical presence nexus with that corporation in the state. That is going to kind of blow the doors wide open in terms of additional revenue sources, states are hoping. And that may alleviate some of these restrictions that we are seeing in terms of their ability to generate taxation. Now, the problem is that blows it wide open for local governments. It's also going to blow it wide open for state governments. This is going to blow it wide open for local governments. We know that oftentimes that revenue then does not, even though it's supposed to be pooled at the state level and flow down to the local level, oftentimes that money doesn't flow downhill. So what we have in this article is it's telling us that we have these limitations on local government's ability to generate revenue. At the same time, our other articles are telling us that categorical grants and these more centralized types of approaches are endemic to our political system. And as long as we have the political system that we currently have in terms of interest group influence, congressional fragmentation and structuring, you're going to have those centralizing forces. And you don't want local governments to become too reliant upon federal revenue, because then they lose control over their own decision making. But if they are losing revenue at the local level and losing the ability to generate local source revenue, whether it be sales tax or property tax revenue, then they may have to become more reliant upon federal revenue. And if they become more reliant upon federal revenue, then they kind of lose some of their ability to self-govern and self-determine their futures. And so I think that's kind of how all these articles kind of fit together. But hopefully from reading these articles this week, you can see the major overlap between last week's focus on politics and this week's focus on finances, in that fiscal federalism is still very much based upon our unique political system in American federalism. And so there's very much an overlap between politics and finance. And then next week, we are going to move ahead in our discussion. And next week, we'll talk about the administrative aspects of federalism. And so we get into the administrative aspects, the articles that we have for next week. We will do the 10 Commandments article, and that one belongs to Alexa. We'll do the Techniques of Intergovernmental Relations, which belongs to Caitlin. We'll do the Politics of Unfunded Mandates, the Paul Posner article, which belongs to Vu. We'll do, hopefully I'm not losing my line here, another look at bargaining, the Agranoff article, which is Esmeralda's, and American Public Administration, the O'Toole article, which is for Denise. And so those are the articles we'll cover next week, looking at the administrative aspects of federalism. And then moving on beyond that, then again, November 11th is Veterans Day, so we do not have class that day. Then on November 18th, we'll start moving into some of the current and future challenges for our system of federalism. Well, thank you very much. Thank you for everyone who was a discussion leader tonight. It was a great discussion of all the articles. I truly appreciate the work you put into prepping your discussions. I hope everyone has a great week, and we'll be back at it then again next Monday at 6 o'clock. So have a great week. Any questions, as always, feel free to reach out to me via email. So I'll talk to you next Monday.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.